trigger warning. Mentions of trauma, death, murder, sexual assault, violence, child abuse, rape, abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, racism, sexism and misogyny, infidelity, PTSD. Two brothers went missing from their village a mere 3 days apart. After investigations, they were found to be killed by a woman they had repeatedly raped and sexually assaulted. Their victim, a serial killer who hid more than just their bodies in her cellar. On April 27, 2010, a group of construction workers in Xinhua Village, located in China's Heilongjiang, were on their break and at the canteen for lunch. The group of workers got very angry due to the long wait for their food, and when they went to confront the cook, he was nowhere to be found. This cook was 65-year-old Lu Xuan, and as he was the eldest of his family, some took to calling him Lu Boss. One of the workers went to Xuan's home and found the front door ajar. He shouted at him several times but nobody answered, so he entered Xuan's home and looked around. Although the lights were still turned on, nobody was home, so he left empty-handed. Most of the workers were not terribly concerned for Xuan's safety and instead upset that they had to go hungry. 20 years prior, Xuan had been divorced and living alone ever since. While most didn't seem to care too much for Xuan's disappearance, there were still a select few who found it odd. Xuan for a long time had been unemployed and not many employers in the village were willing to hire him at his age. And when he finally was hired to be a cook for the construction workers, it was a very recent hire. In fact, his first day on the job was April 24th, so it seemed odd that he would abandon his first real job in a long time so quickly. Eventually, someone asked his family about him, and his brother, 46-year-old Lu Laolu, was the first to hear about his disappearance. Laolu started by looking for Xuan in areas where he was known to spend his spare time. After spending his whole afternoon trying to look for Xuan and coming back empty-handed, he went to the police station to file a report. The police, for their part, didn't have much enthusiasm for the case and barely even looked for Xuan, while Laolu returned home and waited for any news. On April 29th, some of the other villagers needed to meet with Laolu for something. They went to his home, and just like with his brother before him, the door was open and the lights were turned on even though nobody was home. The villagers briefly searched for him, but when they couldn't find him they decided to call his cell phone. The cell phone was however turned off, which was unusual and out of character for Laolu. After failing to find any trace of him, his family reported him missing to the police. The police were completely blindsided and shocked when his family walked in to report him missing, because by all appearances it seemed the police themselves were the last to see Laolu alive when he went to report his brother missing to them. Initially, Xuan's disappearance could have been dismissed as him running away to try and find better work outside his rural village, but his brother going missing only 2 days later was far more suspicious and finally motivated the police to conduct a proper investigation into the two cases. The local police called for assistance from neighboring villages so they could borrow officers to form a task force dedicated solely to investigating this case. On May 7, that task force was formed. As mentioned above, Xuan had been living alone for 20 years and rarely had any contact with those outside his family. Laolu was a different story. He was much more involved in the community as a farmer and working a few other odd jobs and side businesses, earning him many friends in the village. Since Laolu had more of a social life and owned a cell phone which he frequently used, Xuan was again mostly the secondary focus, since police believed there would be a higher chance of tracking down Laolu and that the two cases were likely connected anyway. The police obtained Laolu's cell phone records and bills, which showed him calling many people until the day of his disappearance, when the calls suddenly stopped. Based on this, the police believed that Laolu likely didn't intend to be away for long and that whatever caused his disappearance happened suddenly. After going through his phone records, the police took particular interest in one particular number in his contacts. This number Laolu had called twice. Those two calls were made on April 29, the day he went missing. That number was traced to 40-year-old Su Hong, the local doctor and the owner and operator of the village's medical clinic. Despite being married, Hong's marriage was not a happy one, so 9 years prior she moved back into her old, now deceased parents' home and had been living there alone except for the weekdays, where she lived with her 4 children, 3 of them adopted. The police went to question her at her home. Hong told the police that she once borrowed 5,000 yuan from Xuan in 2009 and another 10,000 from Laolu in order to fund treatment for her children who had fallen ill in 2009. But according to Hong, she had already paid the brothers back. Upon questioning the other villagers, they confirmed that Hong did indeed borrow money from them, but all attested to Hong's good character. When Hong was asked to explain the calls, she said she called him in order to ask him to come over so she could return the money, and after he left she never saw him again. The police conducted a search effort next, attempting to find any bodies or something that would be out of place in the small village, such as strangers or vehicles not belonging to anyone. Both of these efforts came up empty-handed. The next 3 days of the investigation were largely fruitless until a new lead suddenly came to the police. On May 10, Leoliu's sister was sent a text message from her brother. The message read as follows: "Let me be honest with you. I accidentally killed Big Brother. I said I was going to Shandong to find his son, and he got anxious, not letting us approach his son. Why is he like this? At that time, I had been drinking and got into it with him. He got up, so I pushed him, probably too hard. He didn't stand steady, and his head hit the door frame. When I checked, he had no pulse. I was scared, so I took care of Big Brother by moving the motorcycle. I was afraid of getting caught, so I left." The police then raided both of the brothers' respective homes for evidence, putting much emphasis on the search of Leoliu's property. Since the text message stated that Leoliu pushed Shuan and he hit his head against the doorframe, that is where police and forensics concentrated their search. The police saw no signs of a struggle, Shuan's fingerprints couldn't be found, and luminol tests revealed no blood on the doorframe. A search of the home itself also led to the police finding 3,000 yuan just lying around, which would have made no sense if Leoliu was fleeing and going on the run. By all accounts, it would appear that Leoliu didn't send that text and that this story was made up. Upon further examination of the text message, this seemed even more likely. Leoliu was not properly educated, made many typos, and didn't even know how to use punctuation marks. A stark contrast to this perfectly written text message with proper use of punctuation marks. After both the police and his family caught on to this, they decided to call his number, only for no one to answer as the phone was yet again turned off. The police further checked the phone and it made no calls, with its only use between April 30 and May 10 being to send that text message. Throughout the week the phone would be turned back on and send the same text message 10 times to various different people, mostly his family members. This message did not add any real new insight and simply said, "I killed Big Brother. I feel awful. I can never come back again. I did it myself, it's unrelated to anyone else. I'm leaving, take care of yourselves." Since these exonerating texts, including one in which Leoliu admitted to acting alone, came out not long after the police investigated Hong as their first suspect, the oddly convenient timing led to them once again investigating her. They were even more suspicious after one of Leoliu's other brothers told police that he had drunkenly told him that if I die, it will be Su Hong who kills me. On May 19, the police returned to Hong's home to question her further. Hong had answered the police's questions calmly and matter-of-factly. When the police asked if she owned a cellar, however, Hong reacted a bit more panicked and denied owning a cellar. The police were skeptical of this, since in Heilongjiang almost every household owned a cellar to store food and vegetables over the winter, as Heilongjiang is one of China's most northernmost provinces. When the police began searching Hong's yard, sure enough, they did find a cellar entrance hidden under a pile of weeds. As soon as the police opened the entrance, they were instantly hit by a foul stench which made them know they were at the right place. The cellar had clearly been disused for a long while, and inside the police, even without entering the police, could see many empty plastic bags, clothing and human feces. Once Hong saw what they were doing, she became even more panicked and hastily ran over, attempting to block the police from investigating the cellar. The police mostly ignored her attempts and picked up a nearby rake from the ground to dig and poke away at the cellar from the outside. In so doing, they found 2 blue and green sheets that appeared to be brand new. The stench as well as the rotten feces meant that the police, when descending down into the cellar, had to wear gas masks. As the police suspected, those 2 sheets indeed held corpses inside, which the police brought to the surface. The police opened the 2 sheets, and while they had been heavily decomposed, they were still able to recognize them as Shuan and Leoliu. Hong was swiftly arrested, and the news quickly spread to everyone in the village, who were in disbelief that Hong was the culprit, with many straight up refusing to believe it. According to the initial forensic examination, the 2 brothers had died of strangulation. After being interrogated, Hong confessed to the murders. Since she had recently borrowed money from Shuan and later Leoliu, the 2 often used paying off her debt as an excuse to visit her at her home and even clinic. And tragically, they also used this opportunity to sexually assault Hong and have her perform sexual favors in lieu of paying off her debt. As one may expect, Hong was miserable and saddened by this treatment and desperately sought a way out. She told police that life was worse day by day. On April 22, Shuan had apparently, according to some reports, fallen in love with a woman outside the village and was even going to marry her, so in preparation Shuan decided to stop sexually assaulting and raping Hong under the condition that she pay her entire debt with interest. On April 26, She invited Xu over to her home so she could pay him back the money. Before Xu arrived, she had crushed 16 sleeping pills in total into powder and stuffed them into 2 capsules. Once Xu arrived, she convinced him to take the medicine by lying about it being Viagra. After he excitedly took it, he hastily passed out, and Hong seized this opportunity by grabbing a hemp rope and strangled Xu to death with it. Afterwards, she rolled his body up in a sheet and tied that sheet down with rope. 3 days later, she used the same method to call Liu, lure him into his home and kill him in the same manner. Hong finished by disposing of both the brothers' bodies in the family cellar. Hong had confessed. The police saw nothing wrong with her confession and the brothers' bodies had been found. Only, the case wasn't over. The police felt something was odd as the brothers had both died relatively recently, but that cellar was still rancid and filled with human feces, so they thought something else was hidden down there. They were right to think so, as the officers still searching the cellar to clear it out and possibly find any more evidence such as the murder weapon, but they instead found a completely different human skeleton, fully skeletonized with no flesh or skin remaining. The skeleton belonged to a woman, and the police quickly collected DNA samples from the remains and compared them to the families of any local missing person cases. The results quickly came back and they identified her as Su Hong's sister-in-law Li Xing. After being interrogated for 2 days straight, Hong broke and finally confessed to her role in Xing's death as well. Hong's background and life were understandably a large factor in these 2 murders. Hong was born in 1970 in Ning'an. She had both a younger brother and sister, so her parents instructed her to do most of the household chores. In school, Hong studied medicine, and in 1986 she enrolled in Ning'an Health School and was assigned to work as an intern at the Second People's Hospital after her graduation. Her tenure at the hospital was a short one, as in 1990 she resigned in order to Xinhua Village and opened a small clinic there. In 1994, she married her high school boyfriend. This was an unpopular decision and one criticized by her family, as she gave up a career for this wedding. After getting married, she moved into her husband's house in a different village. Their marriage wasn't meant to last, as her husband was almost immediately cheating on her with other women. Hong wanted to divorce him, but her parents talked her out of it. In this rural village, divorce was heavily frowned upon, and it would likely ruin Hong's reputation and set her life back. Eventually, she fathered a child with her husband, and Hong had hoped the birth of their child would fix their relationship, but instead, he didn't seem to care and left all the parenting to Hong. Eventually, when Hong's daughter was 9 months old, her husband left the village to go to work in the south of China. As he was the main provider and was now on practically the complete opposite side of China, Hong was left without a source of income, so she took her daughter and returned to Xinhua Village, where she reopened her clinic upon her arrival. Hong's life didn't get any easier back home, since her siblings also left to go work in the south, meaning that Hong had to care for her parents, her nieces and nephews, her own daughter, and run the village's clinic at the same time. The clinic was not enough to provide for this many people, so eventually she was forced to use a tractor, work on the farm, and do all the work normally delegated to the men of the village. In 2001, Hong learned from others that while working in southern China, her husband had started another affair with a local woman, moved in with her, and even got her pregnant. This was the final straw for Hong, who divorced her husband and began to fully settle into her home in the village. In February of 2003, Hong's sister had returned home and sought out Hong and confided with her. It was here when she confessed to another unknown murder. Her sister was married to Yan Bingtao and told her that she wanted to divorce Bingtao. The two had recently gotten into an argument over something trivial, and Bingtao had escalated the argument by hitting and attacking her, with her rushing over to Hong's home not long after the beating. That next morning, Bingtao had been roaming the village looking for her and later found himself at Hong's home. Hong had her sister hide while she attempted to convince Bingtao to leave. After he refused to leave, an altercation broke out. In this argument, Bingtao threatened to harm his and his wife's children if Hong didn't return her to him. Seeing him on the ground made Hong decide to rid the village of him completely, so she picked up a beer bottle and hit Bingtao across the temple with it. Bingtao began to bleed heavily and writhed, struggled and twitched on the ground for 10 minutes before falling completely motionless. Even if most would have been offering Bingtao their sympathies, taking a life was still a heavily shocking and stressful event. She quickly called her father to tell her what happened, and he arrived not long after. Her father didn't blame Hong and assured her that he would take care of the rest. Hong watched as her father dragged his body toward a nearby tractor and poured gasoline over it. He then covered the body with a pile of weeds and lit it. Hong didn't see what happened next. To finish off the murder, Hong used Bingtao's mobile phone to send a text message to his family explaining that he had left to go work in the south and would not be returning until he made enough money. This convinced his family so much that even in the 7 years between his murder and Hong's confession, nobody even reported him missing. In November of 2005, Ziying returned to the village after working in Ningbai in the Zhejiang province. The reunion started off poorly since Ziying started off by asking to borrow 10,000 yuan from Hong and got angry when she refused. Later that day Hong heard from her mother that Ziying was having an affair which was smearing the family name. The cheating in particular angered Hong greatly. She decided to act upon this anger once Ziying went to sleep in her home. Hong got a piece of hemp rope and strangled Ziying before disposing of her body in the cellar. Afterwards, wrote a fake letter and snuck it into Ziying's family home. The letter stated that she had left the village for work with someone else and not to look for her. Her affair was common knowledge and the talk of the town, so nobody was suspicious or even looked for her. To better hide the bodies and smell, she would use the cellar to dispose of any garbage, dumping it in there and later shoveling up feces and dumping it in the cellar too. Hong's mother passed away in 2006 and her father in 2008, with his death resulting in the location of Bingtao's remains being forever unknown. Hong likely would have never been caught if not for the Liu brothers actually having their disappearance properly investigated. Once the full story went public and was talked about on the news across China, many felt immense sympathy for Hong and were hoping she would get a lenient sentence, if any sentence at all. Hong on the other hand appeared to actually want the death penalty, telling the media that she would rather die than walk free and have everyone look at her and know what she did. The only thing she wondered was, why do men always treat me like this? In January of 2011, Hong's prosecution began and she was quickly found guilty. Hong made no attempt to defend herself, confessed to her crimes and went out of her way to express no remorse, urging the court to sentence her to death as soon as possible. The only thing Hong was concerned about was what would happen to her children afterwards. The Mudanjiang City Court of Heilongjiang Province granted Hong her wish and sentenced her to death. On February 10, 2012, Su Hong was executed. Tina Satchwell was an Irish woman who went missing under suspicious circumstances on March 20, 2017. Her remains were found hidden in her home in October 2023. Her husband, Richard Satchwell, pleaded guilty to her murder. Tina lived with her husband of 25 years, Richard Satchwell, and their 2 dogs in the East Cork seaside town of Youghal. She was 44 years old. Tina disappeared from her home on March 20, 2017. She was last seen the previous day at a car boot sale in a neighbouring town, Carrigtwohill. Richard was the last person to see her, reportedly at 10 a.m. on March 20, 2017. He stated that Tina asked him to go to an Aldi grocery store in Dungarvan to buy fish, and that she was gone by the time he returned around noon. He reported her missing on March 24, 2017. Richard claimed that Tina was depressed and worrying about disputes that were ongoing within the family. He stated that she had left to get her head straight. Tina did not possess a passport and appeared to have left all identification behind. Richard suggested that she may have gone to live with family in the United Kingdom with the help of a third party and €26,000 in cash that she earned by selling the house. Tina's family have always denied this to be true. The Garda Síochána, Irish police force, have said that Tina did not travel through any Irish or UK airport or port. They do not believe she ever left Ireland. There were 2 suitcases missing from the Satchwell home, and Tina's bank account or mobile phone have gone unused since her disappearance. In June 2017, Richard, Tina's husband, made a public appeal for information on the crime crawl show alongside Tina's aunt, Margaret Marr. The following month, due to social media speculation, Richard initially agreed to take a lie detector test but later changed his mind during an interview on Cork's Red FM. In January 2018, RTE, Ireland's national TV station, aired a prime-time, serious talk show, special program about Tina's disappearance. The show featured interviews with Richard, Tina's cousin Sarah Howard, and the Gardaí working on the case. Later that year, Richard also appeared on the Ray D'Arcy Show, less serious talk show, to discuss Tina's disappearance. In March 2018, Garda Síochána conducted a search in Mitchell's Wood near Castlemartyr in County Cork, based on a tip from a member of the public who claimed to have seen someone leaving the woods on the night of Tina's disappearance. Despite extensive efforts, including the use of detection dogs and establishing a no-fly zone, no trace of Tina was found. Additional searches were carried out in scrubland and off the quays in Youghal, but unfortunately, nothing significant was discovered. Gardaí also collaborated with Interpol in their investigation. On the 10th of October 2023, Tina Satchwell's disappearance escalated into a murder investigation. A man in his 50s was apprehended on suspicion of murder and taken to a Garda station in Cork for interrogation. A specialized Garda team was deployed to search Tina and Ricard's home. On the 11th of October 2023, the suspect was released without charges. However, the following day, He was rearrested after human remains were discovered at the Satchwell's residence. The identity of the remains was identified by a belly ring and a Tweety bird tattoo and then confirmed to be Tina through dental records on the 13th of October 2023. On the same day, Richard Satchwell, Tina's husband, was formally charged with her murder. Some tabloid papers have reported that Tina was found by cadaver dogs wrapped tightly in a plastic bag in a room that used to be a small bathroom, underneath the stairs in their home. On the 14th of October 2023, Richard Satchwell appeared before Cashel District Court, where he entered a guilty plea for the murder of his wife. The burned corpse of a woman was found in a park inside black plastic bags. She remained unidentified for 7 years until the killer drunkenly confessed to the victim's daughter. On August 25, 2002, a woman drove to Tianshong in Taiwan's Changhua County for a little vacation and trip intending on spending the weekend with friends hiking through the Chizoiki Forest Park. Since her friends still hadn't arrived, she decided to park her car beside the Chizoiki Trail and looked for a place to relieve herself. As soon as she crossed a ditch in the trail, she became uneasy from the scent of seemingly acetone. She searched the area and found a raised rectangular hill under an acacia tree with an unnatural amount of weeds in the area with black plastic bags faintly visible. After pushing aside the weeds, she found a black plastic bag in the shape of a human body. After poking and prodding the bag, a charred human foot suddenly stuck out from the bag. The police arrived soon after and together with pathologists and forensic technicians began their investigation. They conducted a carpet search of the area to find more evidence. Aside from some more bags and branches used to hide the body, they came back empty-handed. On August 29, the coroner finished his autopsy report and made the following observations. The body belonged to a female around the age of 40 and was 165 centimeters tall. The coroner recovered a large number of fibers from her body, which led him to believe that she was still clothed when her remains were set on fire. The time of death was placed around 20 days ago, between August 1 to August 5. Despite the heavy burning, the medical examiner picked up on strangulation marks on her neck and one of her inner thighs had been split. In order to prevent identification, a corrosive liquid had been poured all over her face and was applied to her fingerprints. Her stomach contents consisted of ethanol and antipsychotic medication, a combination used to make her fall unconscious before the killer murdered her, with the fire and corrosive liquid coming post-mortem. On one of her fingers was a platinum ring with the Buddhist symbol and the English lettering spelling Stark. At some point in her life, she had undergone breast augmentation surgery. Of note to investigators was that her prosthesis weighed in at 240 grams, which was illegal and exceeded the 180 to 220 gram limit under Taiwanese law. Other gold and jewelry like earrings were also recovered. Suicide was obviously ruled out as the cause of death, and due to the presence of gold jewelry, robbery was ruled out as the motive for the murder. Due to her Buddhist rings and illegal breast implants, the police figured that she was not Taiwanese and instead likely hailed from Southeast Asia, with the main countries investigated by the police being the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam and other countries in the region. Due to their suspicions of her being Southeast Asian, they also figured that she may have been a migrant worker or foreign bride killed by her Taiwanese husband. The police then initiated a massive search operation, going through more than 1,000 registered foreign brides and laborers in Changhua County, but none of the missing ones matched the description of the body. The police expanded their efforts by looking into missing Chinese, Japanese or Korean nationals and having police in Taichung, Yunlin and Nantao to go through their own records, but came back empty-handed. Only one woman matching the body's description went missing in early August, and she went missing from Taichung. Investigators printed out and distributed several flyers and appeals for information to the public and local police stations and followed leads for half a month before concluding the investigation and case as unsolved, with the woman remaining unidentified. The Changhua police had finished the investigation with nothing to show to it, but a detective in Taichung named Zhang Wentong heard the news and felt that the body belonged to that one missing woman, and it was someone he knew personally, 40-year-old Chen Jinli. On August 4, Wentong received a phone call from Jinli's daughter Chu Shooting told him that her mother disappeared and wanted to discuss it with him urgently. Jinli and her husband, 40-year-old Chu Kuangyan, met after moving to Taichung from their rural hometowns to work at a sheet metal factory. Due to their similar circumstances, the two soon formed a relationship and later got married and had 3 children: Chu Shooting, Chu Wizhen, and Chu Wei. After having their children, the couple resigned from their job and used their savings and money borrowed from relatives to open up their very own hardware processing factory in the Taiping district. Kuang Yin was often regarded as lazy and barely contributed to the factory and mostly stayed home, while Jinli worked long hours managing the factory alone. In spite of this, The factory soon became profitable and Wentong met Jinli through the factory as her husband Kwang Ian was a police informant often acting as a witness in various theft cases concerning the factory, and his many friends meant that knew someone who would know the thief, with Kwang Ian informing the police about that person. After coming into wealth due to the profits from the factory, Kwang Ian became even worse than he was before. Even though he wouldn't work, he would still spend the profits to fund his own lifestyle, going outside for fun, games and drinking, and had an affair with Janli twice. Kwang Ian's mistresses and their relatives would also show up to the factory during hours and cause trouble, which prompted police calls, with Wentong often showing up to settle the disputes. The adultery also led to the children being scorned and ridiculed. It got so bad that in 1993 the couple filed for divorce. But for the sake of the children they stayed living together, and later in 1995 remarried. Not long after their remarriage, history repeated itself with a second divorce and later remarriage in 1997. But in 1999 the next cheating scandal would be much harder for Jinli to forgive. In the summer of 1999, Jinli hired a woman named Lei Huasai as she was a desperate woman in need of employment after her husband was sentenced to prison for theft. Jinli gave Huasai a good salary and a position as an accountant at the factory. Within a few months, she would be the next woman that Kwang Ian cheated on Jinli with. Jinli was betrayed and fired Huasai in response. As a result, Kwang Ian was eager to rush to Huasai's defense. He had everyone refer to Huasai as the boss's wife and threatened to divide the factory's property and profits as well as marry Huasai due to still technically being a co-owner despite Jinli having done all the work. When his son Wizen confronted him, he ended up dislocating his hand and used this incident to further intimidate and coerce Jinli. Desperate to prevent this from happening, Jinli, who was now good friends with Wentong, asked him to be a mediator. Wentong, who had long grown tired and developed a dislike towards Kwang Ian, agreed. Through Wentong's mediation, Kwang Ian agreed only to take a small portion of the property and pay monthly support to Jinli and his 3 children, of whom he didn't want custody of. That was until early December 2001, when Kwang Ian made another poor decision which reignited the conflict. Kwang Ian, while the factory was closed, secretly moved out into his own home with Huichi, who he had now married, and loaded 2 trucks with the equipment from the factory and moved it all to a new factory that he had opened. Jinli found Kwang Ian in Huasai's new home and went to confront them over this, where she was beaten, humiliated and drove away. A few days later their new factory was opened, and with them going out of their way to poach Jinli's employees and taking away most of her customers. Due to the theft of most of her equipment and later her beating, she went to Wentong to report the matter, but the police considered it a civil dispute, and since Wentong was a detective in the criminal division he had no jurisdiction and couldn't help. Knowing that she was on her own, Jinli decided to retake the machines that Kwang Ian stole from her, and while she succeeded it wasn't for long, as she only managed to take back some of the equipment, and Kwang Ian and Huasai would patrol the factory and hire security guards. They also took it a step further and called the police on Jinli to report the theft of their stolen goods, and the police actually took action and warned Jinli to stop harassing the couple. Kwang Ian, feeling that Jinli was weak-willed and easy to bully, decided to retaliate even further and stopped paying the support money agreed to in their mediation. Jinli was last seen alive on August 2, 2002, when she was seen playing cards with a neighbor when Kwang Ian suddenly entered and whispered something unknown into Jinli's ear before leaving. Jinli stayed behind for another hour to finish her game before leaving. Shooting told Wentong that Jinli wasn't home when she returned from school that day, and she never returned on the 3rd or 4th either, and thought that her father had lured Jinli away and killed her. Wentong also shared the same suspicions and helped Shooting file a police report, but no action was taken. When the body was found and Wentong brought this up, the police ruled out the body belonging to Jinli. Although her height and weight matched, the police were already dead set on the woman being a foreigner from Southeast Asia. Furthermore, no one could tell whether Jinli had breast augmentation surgery, no underground clinics could be tracked down, and she was known for a fact to have never left Taiwan, leaving the police at large certain that the body wasn't Jinli. Not getting any help from his superiors and fellow officers, Wentong decided to investigate by himself. Wentong would introduce and bring potential employers to the factory in hopes of making them act as undercover informants, and the first hire quit because he felt uneasy and always being watched, and soon Kwang Ian began denying potential hires out of fear that they were set up by Wentong, and also uprooted and moved the location of his factory 4 times between 2003 to 2008 to try and avoid Wentong. In the summer of 2006, a local lawyer named Zhang Tingchen was hiking near the Chizoiki Trail with some friends when something odd happened. After passing a certain point he suddenly felt cold and worried that someone had died in this location, so he asked around Changhua for a few weeks before meeting the head of a criminal investigation branch near Tanaka Town, where he was then told about the unsolved case and its unidentified victim. Ting Chin decided to do a little documentary on the case and make the bold claim that he would reveal her identity to the audience via activities akin to seances on live TV. Bizarrely, the show consisted of Ting Chen and the film crew going to the funeral home with the body removed from the freezer for Ting Chen to conduct his seance and ask the questions. Naturally, the program ended with the body remaining unidentified, and it was later buried in a cemetery after the program aired. Although some considered it to be in poor taste, the program was watched by many, with it being a hit and making the case a huge sensation and became mainstream in Taiwan. Zhang Wentong was one such person who watched this program when it aired, and it reignited his resolve to prove that the body belonged to Chen Jinli, and by now he had his superiors convinced too, and they decided to reopen the case, and the investigation started for a second time with Kuang Yin remaining the main suspect. The police as a whole decided to do what Wentong had tried and sent undercover informants to the factory posing as potential hires, but Kuang Yin was still suspicious and wouldn't take the bait. Wentong also convinced Kuang Yin's creditor to enter the factory to discuss debt collection. No new information came from this visit, and she too felt uncomfortable being in the factory. The next step was to make Kuang Yin and Huasai turn on each other. In March 2009, he partnered with a TV program and an electric company to enter the factory under the pretense that they were filming a program about electricity theft. It just so happened that stolen electricity was actually found in the factory, resulting in Kuang Yin being given a fine of 700,000 Taiwanese dollars. This plan worked how Wentong intended, because the factory was already experiencing difficulty, with each year being worse than the last, and this hefty fine ended up being the final straw as Kuang Yin and Huasai got in a heavy argument which ended in Huasai storming out. A few days later, Huasai, still aggravated, approached Shooting and said, "You want to know what happened to your mother? Just ask your father." So whenever Kuang Yin visited, Shooting would go out of her way to deliberately get her father drunk in hopes he'll slip up and say something he would otherwise keep to himself. Eventually, a drunken Kuang Yin did admit to Jinli being dead and even mentioned such details as burning the corpse and beating with a stick, but also never admitted to directly killing Jinli, and also uttered phrases like "I didn't do it and I had no time to stop it." This still left her convinced that Kuang Yin killed their mother. For the police, however, this was a problem, since under Taiwanese law statements made while intoxicated were inadmissible, and he still hadn't confessed to directly killing Jinli, so they couldn't make an arrest just yet. In April 2009, Shooting finally confronted her father and told him that she knew the truth and tried persuading him to turn himself in. She also lied to him and said that her brothers and their families also knew the truth, so they would report him should she go missing too. He confessed but refused to turn himself in because of unfinished business. Shockingly, she decided to let him finish this business. On May 8 she changed her mind. Huasai, alongside her two children from her prior marriage, Lai Zhenfang and Lai Qinghong, approached Shooting's house and became intimidating and mocking Shooting as well as Jinli, with Qinghong even hinting at Jinli being dead and Kuang Yin having killed her, seemingly unaware that she already knew that. Or knew most of it, as they also implied that Huasai was involved directly in the killing. Shooting stayed in her home and called the police, but since they never showed up she called Wentong directly, who rushed over to confront them all in person, accusing them of the murder and later bringing them to the police station. Upon arrival, police were sent to arrest Huasai's two children and two factory workers named Zhang Yucheng, who was 24 years old, and Su Chuankai, who was 23-year-old, making both underage at the time of the murder. They were included in the confessions, and Wentong accused them of being accomplices. The two used to work at Jinli's factory before being poached. Police decided to hold off on interrogating Kuang Yin and Huasai and instead focused on the factory workers and Huasai's children. Her two sons didn't say anything, but Yu Cheng and Chuan Kai confessed to assisting in killing Jinli, with Kuang Yin and Huasai being responsible, and that the body found at Chizoiki Trail belonged to Jinli. Kuang Yin was told of this and soon confessed after reassurances that his children would be fine. Kuang Yin, however, claimed that Huasai was the mastermind. Huasai denied any involvement, but once she found out that everyone else came clean, she soon became enraged and confessed as well. According to the confessions, Kuang Yin and Huasai decided to kill Jinli after a brief discussion on how to deal with her so-called harassment. Kuang Yin tested a brand of sleeping medication on Huasai, and once he saw that it worked, decided that he would trick Jinli into taking it. The plan was to trick Jinli into taking the medication when she wasn't paying attention and put her in their car to drive her to a remote area. Afterwards, before she could wake up, she'd be strangled with a towel, beaten with a wooden stick, and they'd use either acid or caustic soda to disfigure her face and fingerprints. Once all was said and done, they'd finish it by setting her on fire. On August 2, 2002, Huasai rented a minibus and invited the two factory workers and were filled in on the plan. They also lied to the workers about Jinli's character, telling them that they were underpaying the two and prevented Kuang Yin from raising their wages as a ploy to anger them and give them more motivation. What they didn't tell them about the revenge plan was that it involved murder. Kwang Yin then went to the neighbor's house where Jinli was playing cards. Once arriving, he persuaded her to come to Chiayi with him to discuss her relationship. She accepted and they met at the Yuzhong Bridge in Taiping. Under the guise of having a drink, Kwang Yin poured Jinli some wine that he laced with the sleeping medication. Once Jinli fell unconscious, he called Huasai, who was waiting at home. After a half hour, she arrived at the bridge. She was loaded into the van and driven back to the factory where all the weapons and tools used to commit the murder were sourced from. Afterwards, they traveled to Taoyuan in a rural mountainous region. Once there, Yu Cheng and Chuan Kai were ordered to strangle Jinli with the towel. The towel was too short and the workers too weak to strangle her, and Jinli soon regained consciousness and began struggling. In a rage, Kwang Yin forced her out of the bus and soon Kwang Yin, Huasai, Yu Cheng and Chuan Kai began beating her with sticks. After the beating concluded, Jinli still lived, so Kwang Yin ordered Yu Cheng and Chuan Kai to restrain her while he repeatedly hit her head. Jinli still wouldn't die and the workers told police that they could see her shedding tears during the beating. Kwang Yin decided as a last resort to pour the gasoline all over Jinli before she passed away and lit it. The workers again told the police that they could hear her screaming, crying and writhing for over 2 minutes before she finally died. Kwang Yin then extinguished the body before any nearby villagers could notice the fire. Once Jinli finally passed away, Kwang Yin poured caustic soda and acid all over Jinli's face, chest and fingerprints. All four then placed her body into black plastic bags and drove to the Chizoiki Forest Park Trail, where they disposed of it and hid it under some weeds and branches. The four the next day also burned all the weapons, materials and the clothes they were wearing before finally returning home. On May 14, 2009, authorities exhumed the body and a coroner conducted a second autopsy to see if the wounds matched the details of the confession. The medical examiner noticed the blunt force wounds to her remains which the previous coroner missed, which added credence to the confession. The front of the victim's body was still severely burnt, but there were also burn wounds to the back and traces of smoke in the respiratory tract, which meant that she had been burned alive. The remaining traces of corrosive liquid were tested and confirmed to be caustic soda. The medication was also retested and found to be clothiapine, which was the drug Kwang Yin described using. DNA was taken from the body and compared to Jinli's 3 children, with the results coming back a match and definitively identifying the body as Chen Jinli. The trial was held at the Taiwan Supreme Court, and the court and prosecutor did not believe any of them when they tried to claim that only the others were responsible. Yu Cheng and Chuan Kai claimed that they didn't know the plan involved murder and were deceived into killing Jinli, but the court rebuked this claim. The court pointed out that they were presented when all four went to the factory to gather the sticks, towel, gasoline and caustic soda while Jinli was unconscious in their van, and pondered what exactly they thought they were doing if not killing Jinli. Huasai also claimed that she didn't know they were going to kill Jinli and only beat her with the sticks under Kwang Yin's coercion. She claimed that the money given to Kwang Yin to buy clozapine was for herself, but her own children contradicted this when they went to Shooting's house to harass her, as they said that they never expected Huasai to take it since your mother drank it. The sons had no involvement in the actual murder back when it happened. Since she rented a minibus for the murder, they also argued that Huasai was involved in planning the crime too. All three denied setting the fire because they didn't have a lighter or cigarettes, but Huasai, before Jinli was set on fire, said, "You all smoke, how can there be no fire?" Which was a massive contradiction. Kwang Yin on several occasions accused Huasai of being the mastermind. He claimed that Jinli wanted to remarry him, and thus he got in several arguments with Huasai over it. They also questioned his remorses, even though he told his daughter he would turn himself in after finishing his business. He told Wentong and the police that Shooting was talking nonsense and denied everything, and once he finally confessed to try to minimize his responsibility. The two had also planned 2 separate murder plots, such as staged accidents or suicides, which further pointed to Kwang Yin being remorseless and the mastermind. On November 18, 2010, all 4 were found guilty, with Kwang Yin being given a life sentence due to being the mastermind and the one who directly killed Jinli. Lai Huasai was sentenced to 18 years imprisonment due to her being a part of the premeditation process and her role in the killing. Zhang Yucheng and Su Chuan Kai were given 8 and 7 years respectively. The case was a sensation in Taiwan and incited public outrage. The source of the anger was with the Changhua police for their inaction, and the local medical examiner also faced public ridicule for not noticing the blunt force wounds and the telltale signs that she had been burned alive. The Taichung police also received heavy criticism for how long it took for them to accept that the body belonged to Jinli, essentially ignoring Wentong. Many attribute the case being solved solely on Zhang Wentong, with many saying that if not for him and him alone, Chen Jinli would still be unidentified with her murder unsolved. The body of a 7-year-old girl was found in a cardboard box on the street hours after she went missing. The main suspect's sudden suicide would be what led police to the other murderers. On March 17, 2002, in the neighborhood of Piedras Redondas located in Almeria, Spain, a 7-year-old Romani girl named Montserrat Fajardo who lived with her family and had a lively, outgoing, and sweet personality and was widely beloved by her neighbors went to her cousin's house with her mother Joaquina Cortés to celebrate her cousin's 4th birthday. Due to a change of plans, Joaquina had to drop Montserrat off at her cousin's home saying she'd pick her up in 3 hours before leaving in a hurry. Montserrat didn't hear this as she began playing almost immediately without hearing her mother's words. 2 hours later she told her cousin's parents that she wanted to go play at her great-grandmother's house and so left to walk to the nearby home. After an hour at her great-grandmother's, she was finally told to walk back to her home. On her way home she came across some relatives who didn't attend the birthday playing outside so instead of going home she decided to join in on the game. When Montserrat's mother finally arrived to pick her up she was told that she went to her great-grandmother's. When she went there she was told she left to go home on her own. When she returned home Montse wasn't there. She searched the neighborhood to find her but Montserrat was still nowhere to be found. Soon her neighbors volunteered to help search. Her father believed she had been kidnapped as she knew the neighborhood well and thought it impossible that she simply got lost which prompted them to call the police. The police came to the same conclusion as Montserrat's father and believed that she had been kidnapped. The police had no leads to begin the investigation or suspects and Montserrat's family hadn't received any ransom messages. Police began by searching the neighborhood and questioning witnesses and trying to see if anyone saw her. At 1:45 a.m. on March 18 two of Montserrat's neighbors saw a cardboard box on the side of the road that wasn't there 20 minutes earlier. The two men had a bad feeling about this and opened the box. Once they did they saw the body of a child with her entire body except for her head wrapped in cloth. The police arrived at the scene with Montserrat's family who identified the body as Monst based on hair color, body type and partially recognizable face. Police questioned the two who discovered the body and they explained that they traveled down that street several times during their search for Montserrat but didn't see the body until then. Based on this information the police assumed that the killer was simply waiting for the right opportunity to dispose of the box and that the killer was likely one of the residents who took part in the search efforts. The police conducted an evidence search in the nearby area but the only clues were the box and body. The autopsy revealed that Montserrat had suffered several puncture wounds to her organs and had been stabbed 36 times. The cause of death was a heavy blow to the back of her head. She had suffered from subcutaneous ecchymosis due to several blunt force wounds and blood loss from her stab wounds. Her neck/throat had been cut. 80% of her body had also been burnt with a corrosive liquid likely acid which the medical examiner tragically enough, believed happened prior to death. Based on the injuries it is believed that there was more than one killer. Even though she was naked and suffered several horrific injuries there were no signs of sexual assault. Markings on her wrist and ankles showed that she had been bound at some point prior to her body being discovered and her mouth and nose had also been taped at some point. The time of death was placed at 8 o'clock to 11 p.m. The police felt that the murder was motivated by revenge or personal reasons based on the brutality involved. Her family was highly doubtful and skeptical of the police's conclusion as they had a lot of goodwill in the community and were easygoing and helpful and thus felt it impossible for anyone to hold a grudge against them. Lacking any clues or suspects the police began their investigation by trying to track down the box. It was a folding table packing box, 80 by 80 centimeters with the inside and out cleaned and not stained with blood. The box was likely purchased very recently. The police visited as many nearby stores as possible to try and find where the box came from and who purchased it. As for the cloth her body was wrapped in, the police questioned all the residents to see if they'd seen it before or could identify the owner. Their efforts paid off as the owner of a grocery store told police that a 40-year-old man Antonio Santiago purchased a table from his store 3 to 4 weeks prior. Antonio was also related to the family as he was the husband of 33-year-old Francisco Fajardo, Montserrat's father, cousin Juana. Antonio also lived only a dozen meters away from where Montserrat's body was found. Antonio lived in poverty with his wife and 2 children. To make matters worse, during his military service in the 1980s, he suffered an accident during training which left him with brain damage and a slight disability in his left arm. These factors combined with his low education meant that he could only work menial labor jobs with low pay. His wife 36-year-old Juana Santiago only had part-time jobs as she had very little free time and spent most of her time looking after the couple's children and the house. Antonio was described as taciturn, timid, withdrawn and wouldn't listen to his wife, with him using most of his disability payments to give to his mother and aunt, while Juana was described as overly competitive with a huge sense of self-importance, leading many in the neighborhood to dislike the couple. The police applied for a search warrant to search Antonio's home and keep his family under surveillance as he was the main suspect. On March 19, their warrant was accepted and they went to summon him for questioning, only to suddenly receive reports that Antonio had hanged himself from a tree not far from where Montserrat's body was found. At 12:30 p.m. Antonio's body was found by a group of school children hanging from a tree 4 meters away from the location Montserrat's body was found. Under his feet was a pile of salt weighing 500 grams. According to sources, this salt was related to a Romani custom which signified that justice had been done. Juana first noticed Antonio going missing earlier that morning and assumed he had gone out to buy cigarettes. After waiting for hours, she felt that something was wrong and asked her aunt-in-law to help her look for him, but he was still nowhere to be found, and because of Montserrat's funeral they had to stop looking for him to attend it. The police canvassed the scene for witnesses and couldn't find anyone who actually watched Antonio hang himself or make the salt pile. The police also ordered an autopsy which showed he had no wounds to his body, had no drugs or alcohol in his system, and the scene displayed no signs of a struggle. The autopsy revealed that Antonio passed away from a carotid artery rupture and an interruption of his cerebral blood supply. The police, based on these facts, ruled that Antonio died of a suicide just as things appeared. The motive, according to the police, was likely remorse and guilt over Montserrat's murder, as well as pressure and stress from the police investigation. News of Antonio's suicide and that he had purchased the box spread through the community, which incited outrage and soon made his surviving family a pariah, with their neighbors, relatives and fellow residents bad-mouthing and ostracizing them. The police likewise looked at his family with suspicion. If Antonio was the murderer, he likely committed the murder in his home, and if he did so, Juana would likely have some knowledge of the crime, so the police went through with their search warrant. As soon as officers entered the room, they were struck by the odor of bleach and detergent, and the entire interior of the home appeared to be damp. The home was also completely spotless and tidy to an absurd degree. The police went to the second floor, and not only did they smell bleach but also lingering stench of sulfuric acid and decay. The smell was so overpowering that nearly every 10 or so minutes they had to leave to get some fresh air. Inside the home, the police found even more damning evidence, such as half a bottle of sulfuric acid, a couch cover which was the cloth wrapped in was missing, a 50 centimeters high, 40 centimeters diameter black wooden barrel with traces of sulfuric acid, which police believed to be the container in which Montserrat's body was burned, 5 garbage bags containing bloody clothes, including the clothes Montserrat was wearing when she disappeared, but her shoes and socks were still missing. The police conducted luminol tests and found bloodstains on the front yard, the edge of a second-floor locker, a corner of the bathtub, a mop handle, and several tiles on the first-floor living room floor indoors. Tests revealed that this blood belonged to Montserrat. The police confiscated a chair, a used cardboard box, a pair of rubber gloves and the stuffed animals of their 11-year-old daughter Maria to see if they could extract any usable evidence, but were unable. The murder weapon wasn't recovered either. On the second-floor balcony, the police extracted shoe prints from 5 different people belonging to Juana, Antonio and Montserrat, with the other 2 being unidentified. Juana had fresh stab wounds and burns to her right hand, left upper arm, and left leg, which police believe to have happened accidentally during the murder. A solvent sample was also extracted from Juana's fingernails, which was consistent with the sulfuric acid residue on Montserrat's body. Juana was soon placed under arrest. After the arrest, police began to track down witnesses and came across one who claimed to see Montserrat following Juana around the community square at 7:40 p.m. on March 17. Juana and Antonio's neighbors heard loud music blaring from the home with muffled sounds of a fight. They also heard Antonio talking with an unknown man and their daughter Maria crying. During the initial search efforts, Francisco went to their home and asked if they saw Montserrat, but they completely denied it. On March 18, when interviewed by reporters, Juana, while next to Joaquina, said she would pay money to see Montserrat's killers murdered themselves. At 10:45 p.m. on March 17, a neighbor saw Juana, her daughter Maria, and her sister 48-year-old Engracia Santiago standing in front of the house and looking around. 15 minutes later at 11, Juana was outside smoking and looking around distressed. At the funeral, Juana suddenly left and had to borrow someone's car, claiming that she needed to drop off garbage and take Maria to a hospital. Juana didn't return until the funeral was over. Strangely, the doctor she drove Maria to was 40 minutes from her home and not the doctor she usually took her daughter to. Based on all the circumstantial evidence, police thought it exceedingly likely that Juana was involved in Montserrat's murder, likely luring or kidnapping her and bringing her back home to be killed by Antonio, or to join Antonio in killing her. Based on witness statements and shoe prints, Engracia and an unidentified man were likely accomplices. The trash that Juana went to throw out was likely Montserrat's missing belongings and the murder weapon, but unfortunately, the trash was already collected and disposed of before the police could investigate. After Juana's arrest, many rumors started, with the main one being that Juana killed Montserrat and drove Antonio to suicide so she could use him as a scapegoat. When questioned, Juana struggled to remain consistent and changed her story 5 times, but with 3 main versions of events. Her first confession was on March 21. According to her, Montserrat was playing with Maria when she lured her toward her home and together with Antonio beat her to death in front of Maria. According to her, the fatal blow came when Angracia came in looking for medicine and joined in on the beating. Angracia was also the one to pour the acid over Montserrat's body, according to her. Afterwards, Antonio, after making sure Montserrat was dead, slit her throat post-mortem and asked Juana to give him a cloth to clean up the blood while he removed the couch cover to conceal Montserrat's body in. Afterwards, Juana drove to dispose of Montserrat's belongings and the murder weapon while Antonio disposed of the body and box on his own. Juana refused to tell police where she disposed of the weapon and belongings. On March 30, she changed her story and gave a different confession. In this confession, she said that all she and Angracia did was simply watch while Antonio did everything. She claimed that his timid personality was only an act and that Antonio was violent and abusive, having attacked her several times, leaving her too afraid to stop Antonio from murdering Montserrat. Juana said that she regretted not stopping her and that Antonio forced her to clean up the home and evidence, not even allowing her to take Maria to the doctor until she was finished. Nearly 9 months later, in December 2002, she changed her story again. She said that her family went to her mother's house across the street from where Montserrat was celebrating her husband's birthday. Antonio was only there shortly before excusing himself and leaving, while Juana and Maria stayed until 8 p.m. Since it was a Sunday, she took Maria to see Angracia. Once they got there, only Angracia's children were home, but she stayed anyway since Maria wanted to play with them. They stayed until 12 a.m. While there, she overheard some of the neighbors talking about the search effort for Montserrat, but at the time she had no idea what had happened. This is in spite of witness statements placing her at her home around this time. When she returned home with Maria, she went to a storage room and found Montserrat bound and on the floor, with Antonio saying that she was dead and bleeding everywhere. Also present was Angracia's 52-year-old husband, Antonio Fernandez. Fernandez handed Antonio a bottle of sulfuric acid while Angracia was also there looking on. Juana tried to stop Fernandez, which resulted in her hand being burnt by the acid, while Antonio during the struggle slit Montserrat's throat. Antonio then told Juana to clean the house and place her body in the couch cover and later the box while Antonio went to dispose of the body. Juana in this confession told police that she loved Montserrat and was racked with guilt over not preventing her death. Before this final confession, on March 23, police arrested Angracia based on the circumstantial evidence and Juana's first confession. During her questioning, she denied any involvement in the murder and said that on March 17 she only saw Juana twice. Once, when she went to her home at 8 p.m. to deliver some medicine. While talking outside, she was told about Montserrat's disappearance, so she returned home and set out with Fernandez to help find her. The second time was at 11 p.m. when she returned to Juana's home to grab a sweater she left behind as it was cold when she was outside during the search. After picking up the sweater, she continued searching until 1 a.m. when she returned home with Fernandez. According to Fernandez, however, nothing Angracia said was true. After delivering the medicine, the two went straight to their eldest son's house located 2 blocks away, stayed there until late into the night and returned home. However, according to their son, he never saw them that night, and even if they had gone to his house they still wouldn't have him to confirm their alibi as he was away that day. Once this came out, Angracia soon did what Juana did and changed her story. She changed her story to include the fact that her son wasn't home, so she left and returned to her own home. At 11:47 p.m. Juana made a phone call to Angracia's home. This was not the airtight alibi that Angracia and Fernandez had hoped it'd be, though. The call was answered by their younger daughter, who told police that neither of her parents were home at the time. Angracia was unable to offer up any other alibis. The police searched Angracia and Fernandez's home and found the same type of tape that was placed over Montserrat's mouth and an empty bottle with traces of acid in it, with forensic tests revealing it to be the same acid used on Montserrat. They also compared the shoe prints found on Juana's balcony to the shoes from their home. They matched one pair of footprints to Angracia, but the other unidentified pair was too degraded to positively attribute to Fernandez, and due to a lack of physical evidence and Juana's repeated lies and changed testimony, the only way to confirm if Fernandez was the unidentified male at the house was Maria's testimony. Maria, however, did in fact witness the murder and was left too shaken and traumatized to talk to the police. After 8 months of counseling and therapy, she finally made a statement in November. At the time of the murder, she was home with both her parents and Angracia. Angracia and Fernandez were the ones who bound Montserrat while Juana repeatedly slashed and stabbed her with a knife. While this was happening, Antonio did nothing and watched. Montserrat's mouth was also taped shut from the start to keep her from alerting any neighbors. This went on for a while until Juana began pouring acid over her body. Maria, who was watching this whole time and crying throughout, ran away to another room. Maria was unable to give any more details about the murder to the police, as once she finally worked up the courage to leave the room, she exited to see her parents up all the evidence and stains, as well as throwing some of Montserrat's clothing, blood-stained items that couldn't be washed, and the murder weapon into black garbage bags. The first half of her confession was largely consistent with Juana's first testimony, and her identification led to police arresting Fernandez in December. The crime outraged Spain's Roma community, with many taking to the streets to demonstrate and demand that police and judicial system hand down harsh punishments to all those involved. The case also caused the tensions with and isolation of Juana's remaining family, and soon Montserrat's father Francisco was seeking his own vengeance outside of the judicial system. Francisco bided his time stalking and learning the habits of Juana's oldest child, 21-year-old Antonio Fernandez Santiago, who by all metrics appeared to have had no involvement or knowledge of the murder. He learned his habits and schedule, and on September 28, 2002, he, alongside a 17-year-old girl whose name had been withheld, followed him to the town of Huércal del Maria, located in Spain's Andalusia region. He then drove up to Santiago's car and, using a pistol that Francisco had purchased on the black market, fired several shots at him. The gunshots alerted nearby residents, and Santiago himself called the police, and in a stroke of luck, a police car just happened to be in the area when the call came in, forcing Francisco to flee. In early 2003, Francisco and the 17-year-old were arrested at their homes, and Francisco was charged with illegal possession of firearms and attempted murder. He was given a 7-year sentence, while the 17-year-old was remanded to a juvenile detention center. When it came to the motive for Montserrat's murder, the police had to rely entirely on circumstances and other testimony, as Angracia and Fernandez continued to deny any guilt, while Juana refused to answer any questions relating to motive. According to Montserrat's grandfather, he thought that the motive was jealousy, as their families did not have any feuds prior to this. Everyone in the neighborhood and extended family held Joaquina in high regard, while Juana, as mentioned, wasn't very popular. Montserrat was also largely beloved, while Juana's own daughter Maria wasn't given any special thought over others and was quite shy and timid. Montserrat was also accused of teasing Maria while at school, to which Maria would return home and ask for help, but due to a lack of money and poor relations with everyone else, Juana and Antonio did nothing, which many thought made them resent Montserrat and her family even more. While this was the most likely motive, others tried to ascribe an occult and spiritual motive to the crime, as according to neighbors, Juana often spoke of occult practices. This caused many to think Montserrat was a sacrifice, but this was largely ignored as more and more evidence supporting jealousy, personal and financial motives turned up. Angracia and Fernandez, back in 2000, borrowed 150,000 Spanish pesetas from Montserrat's grandmother and agreed to pay it back. They did, however, take their time and delayed repayment until 2 weeks before Montserrat's murder. Not only did they refuse to pay back the money, they were hostile about it and didn't want to pay them. They thought that Montserrat's family was well off enough, and that to them the money they wanted repaid was worthless. This resulted in many heated arguments, sometimes in public in the middle of the street. During the argument, one of Montserrat's relatives in the heat of the moment threatened to kill the couple's children, to which Fernandez fired back with the same threat. Regardless of what the motive likely is, no one knows for a fact what the truth is, as no one involved ever spoke of it to the police. The trial began on October 3, 2005, in the Provincial Court of Almería under heavy security. The trial had 56 witnesses and 13 experts called to testify. The prosecution argued that Juana was the mastermind and told the court the most likely version of events. Juana was with Antonio driving through the neighborhood when they saw Maria and Montserrat playing by a small town square with no one else around. Juana likely saw this as an opportunity to get some form of revenge against Joaquina, so she coaxed Montserrat back to her house. Once they got home, they forced her to the second floor, where she was undressed and tied to a chair with her mouth being taped over to stop her from yelling for help. Juana then beat and stabbed her and tried many times to make her own now traumatized daughter Maria to join in. At around 8 p.m. Angracia went to the home to drop off some of Juana's medication when she heard the commotion upstairs. She went upstairs where she saw what happened, and due to her own grievances with Joaquina and her family decided to join in, or at the very least did nothing to stop Juana. Juana then finished it off by pouring acid over Montserrat as she was near death. She then in her anger cut her throat after death. As for Antonio, it turns out he wasn't involved in the actual murder, and Juana didn't think ahead or know what to do after killing Juana. Antonio committed suicide out of stress over what may happen and guilt for his albeit small role in the murder. According to the prosecutor, Antonio had a history of being weak-willed and unable to stand up for himself or even his daughter whenever bullying became a problem, so he was likely too scared to stop Juana from kidnapping and killing Montserrat, and why he agreed to help dispose of the body. During the trial, Juana recanted all of her prior statements and claimed complete ignorance. She told the court that both she and Maria never saw Montserrat that night, that she and Maria wasn't even home, and that Angracia and Fernandez never visited their home, and that Antonio was the only one home that night and that he must have done everything and that all blame lay with him. She then said that Antonio threatened to kill her when she returned home if she didn't help clean up all the evidence and dispose of Montserrat's body. In her desperate pleas to the judge, prosecutor and jury, Juana ended up sealing her fate when she said, "I wasn't the only one in the family at the time, and if I had to pay the price, no one else was going to get away with it." Which to them confirmed that Juana was involved and had accomplices. On October 20, 2005, Juana Santiago, Angracia Santiago, and Antonio Fernandez were sentenced to 25 years imprisonment and ordered to pay €150,000 in compensation. Joaquina screamed in joy after hearing the verdict and said that justice had been done. On November 6, the three appealed their sentence, although Fernandez passed away of an illness while in prison in December 2005. On May 15, 2006, the Court of Appeal commuted Juana and Angracia's sentence from 25 to 23 years but made no changes to the compensation needed to be paid. Michael Silka, an Illinois man that went on a killing spree in the remote Alaskan village of Manly Hot Springs, and was shot dead in a shootout with state troopers, 1984. Illinois native Michael Silka was a mass murderer who committed a 1984 killing spree in Manly Springs, Alaska. He had a lifelong fascination with both the wilderness and firearms, and sought to live like the 19th-century mountain men of the American West that he idolized. Throughout his teenage years, Silka's obsessive interests had propelled him into having several brushes with the law. Silka was arrested several times for robbing sporting goods stores for camping equipment and guns. He also ran away to the Canadian wilderness with his brother at one point, and the two only returned home when their supplies ran out. Silka was also frequently detained and fined for publicly carrying a 19th-century muzzle loader. In 1978, shortly after one of arrests pertaining to openly carrying his musket, Silka joined the U.S. Army. During his service, he was stationed in Fort Wainwright. Despite being exceptionally skilled with his service weapons and basic training, he proved to be unruly. Silka had several infractions on his record, including discharging his gun in the barracks and assaulting military police personnel. This all culminated him in being discharged in 1981. In civilian life, Silka still continued his pattern of violating weapons possession laws. Silka was pulled over by traffic patrolmen in 1982, and they found a .44 caliber revolver, a .22 caliber pistol, and 2 knives in his car. He tried resisting the officers during their search, which added a resisting arrest charge. Silka ended serving a total of 4 days in jail. A similar incident occurred in 1983, when patrolmen pulled Silka over, and found a .22 caliber rifle in his car's backseat. Silka skipped bail and fled to Alaska. Silka moved to Chena Ridge, a remote Alaskan village. Trouble quickly started brewing shortly after Silka's arrival, when his 34-year-old neighbor Roger Culp went missing. Although Culp's body wasn't found, traces of blood were discovered in the snow near his home. Silka was the immediate person of interest, and he disappeared before he could be questioned by officers. He reappeared about a month later in Manly Springs, another remote Alaskan village that only contained a population of 80 residents. Silka quickly impressed the local with his prowess in the outdoors. He set up a tent near the boat landing, and lived in it. On May 17, a group of 6 locals, which consisted of 30-year-old Fred Burke, 27-year-old Albert Hagen, 36-year-old Lyman Klein, Lyman's 30-year-old pregnant wife Joyce E., their 2-year-old son Marshall, 24-year-old Dale Matitsky, and 38-year-old Larry McVeigh went missing near the boat landing. Their disappearances were reported by their family and friends. When officers searched the site, they found blood and used cartridges. Silka was the immediate suspect, and he fled upstream with Burke's stolen boat. Authorities launched a search with 2 helicopters. They found Silka a day later 25 miles away from Manly Springs. As they were hovering in their helicopters, the officers ordered Silka to surrender, but he refused and opened fire on them. A 34-year-old trooper named Troy Duncan was killed by a gunshot to the head, while his captain Donald Lawrence was wounded in the face by the same bullet. The officers then killed Silka with their return fire. Silka was 25 years old at the time of his death. The shootout was so intense that officers involved that were Vietnam veterans likened it to combat in the war. After Silka's death, the victim's family, friends, and the authorities combed all across the river for their bodies. 4 of the bodies were discovered months later, while the remaining 4, including Culp's, still remain lost to this day. Burke in particular was discovered 75 miles away from the murder site by his wife Lillian. Silka's motivations are unknown and taken with him to the grave. Police went to arrest a gang of teenagers over what they believed to be a simple assault. Instead, they confessed to beating up a teenager and setting his corpse on fire. On May 16, 1997, a 999 call was made from Hong Kong's Kowloon district. The caller was a middle-aged man who incoherently told the operator that he was seriously injured and needed an ambulance to bring him to the hospital. He then hung up after a series of barely intelligible words. The ambulance arrived 30 minutes later and rushed him to the United Christian Hospital in Kwun Tong district. At the hospital, the man was delirious and unable to explain where his injuries came from or even the injuries at all, just that he was injured. After a doctor examined him, he noted several bruises and fractured bones likely from a beating, prompting the doctor to inform the police. Police spent several hours questioning the man in the hospital until they finally learned his information. The man lived in an apartment building in Kwun Tong district and was identified as 36-year-old Chan Muk Ching, and he worked as a sanitation worker. Muk Ching did not know for sure who had attacked him and could only identify 2 of them by the nicknames Abai and a Chick. These 2 people lived in the Sao Mau Pang estate, which is across the street from the payphone Muk Ching called the police from. At 12 a.m. on May 17, police rushed to the apartment to track down and question those 2. A Chick was nowhere to be found, but they arrested Abai, whose real name was Shi Zijian, a 16-year-old student. Several accomplices were also detained. The police only made the arrests to question them over Muk Ching's beating, but all those questioned seemed to have a different idea and confessed to something much more horrifying instead. All of those arrested were under the age of 18, and yet in spite of it they were all gang members and identified themselves as triads. The oldest and leader, a Chick whose true identity was 17-year-old Hui Chi Wei, who like Muk Ching was employed as a cleaner. Hui Chi Wei also had a record, as in 1996 he was sentenced to 1 year imprisonment for a petty assault. He also frequently rallied up others to go to war and fight and beat up other child/teen gangs. Most of them also had records for other petty crimes, and the police found reason to visit Sao Mau Ping several times before this case. Muk Ching was attacked by the gang, as while on shift working and cleaning in the area he would attempt to persuade others to leave the gangs and continue their education to try and better their futures. Hui Chi Wei saw this as a problem, but violence wasn't his first choice. He would start by trying to intimidate him and in other times using his female friends to try and seduce Muk Ching in hopes that this would motivate him to stop. Hui Chi Wei would also set small fires in the area to further intimidate him, but Muk Ching never gave up. And even more aggravating, his words were actually reaching other gang members. Most notably 15-year-old Luk Chi Wei. Luk Chi Wei seemed genuinely eager to change his ways and leave. He only seemed to be in the gang for the relationships with others and was always reluctant to get involved in the others' criminal activities. And while they left the apartment to go commit crimes, Luk Chi Wei would often stay behind to talk with Muk Ching and help him with his cleaning work and duties. On May 12, Hui Chi Wei didn't go to his part-time job simply out of laziness, and while he was inside, Muk Ching ended up meeting his mother and explained to her what her son had been up to, and she was shocked. She then told his father, and both of his parents were outraged and scolded and chewed him out. Hui Chi Wei paid them no mind until later that afternoon once they left. He gathered up a bunch of fellow gang members, and once Muk Ching's shift started they rushed towards him and spent 2 hours beating him. Once this was over, Luk Chi Wei found out what happened and rushed toward him after everyone left to tend to his wounds, and even tried encouraging him to contact the police. 2 days later, on May 14, Hui Chi Wei heard of this encounter. They were all angered at Luk Chi Wei's actions and thus sought to make him pay for his backbone. At 9 p.m. he was lured into the exact apartment of Sao Mau Peng where the members stayed. Hui Chi Wei couldn't take part due to family and personal issues at the time, so in his place 17-year-old Fu Hin-chun orchestrated the beating. Hin-chun in 1993 was sentenced alongside another involved 17-year-old Mok Kei-ho to 1 year of behavior therapy and treatment for a robbery. Others involved were 14-year-old Xu Zhiyong, 16-year-old Ng Ming-chun, who also had a 1993 conviction for theft, 14-year-old Ruan Kit-yi, 16-year-old Chan Tak-ming, who had a 1995 conviction for his involvement in a street fight, 14-year-old Liu Pei, 14-year-old Wang Campo, 14-year-old Zhou Jun, 15-year-old Chen Ken-gu, 14-year-old Luo Gaifan, 14-year-old Huang Jinbao, and lastly Shi Zijian. Once Look Chi-wei arrived, the beating started in full force immediately. They attacked him with their hands and feet before escalating to folding chairs, and once Hui Chi-wei was done with his family issues, he returned home, and once he saw that the beating was still going on half an hour later, he joined in beating Look Chi-wei with a plastic pipe. They continued for 3 hours until Look Chi-wei finally passed from his injuries. All those involved suddenly became scared and fearful, as despite their lengthy list of crimes, this was the first life they had ever taken. Some wanted to call the police and turn themselves in, while others suggested finding a black market doctor to see if he could resuscitate Look Chi-wei. Hui Chi-wei and Hin-chun calmed everyone down, and eventually, they settled on carrying the body to an abandoned building while others went out to purchase gasoline. Mok Kei-ho suggested disposing of the body in mountainous areas to be scavenged by wild animals or a landfill to go undiscovered. Acting under Hin-chun's orders, they removed the now burnt clothes from the body and tied it up with bed sheets and wires. Afterwards, Hui Chi-wei and Chan Tak-ming went out to look for a cart to use to transport the body, but had to stop as there was a coincidental police patrol happening in the area. During this time, according to Muk Ching, was seriously injured and hiding in his home, too afraid to go to the police due to Look Chi-wei being nowhere to be seen and the rest of the gang threatening him. Due to that well-timed police patrol, the gang had to delay disposing of Look Chi-wei's body, but this time was used to purchase some acid and other tools needed to hinder identification and move the body, as well as think of a possible new plan. They then placed the corpse into a cardboard box which they sealed shut with tape. They put a bunch of items and belongings into the box so it would look like they were disposing of garbage. They lifted the box into a cart and began moving it towards the apartment's garbage disposal room. The specific block of the apartment they picked was due to be demolished soon, and most of the residents already moved out, so they figured the body would still be undiscovered, as well as what they'd do to it. Once they arrived, Hin-chun had others act as lookouts and pretend to carry furniture on the off chance that someone else came by. They then poured acid and gasoline onto his body before setting it on fire. Afterwards, they waited outside for 2 hours until the fire naturally burned itself out. Once that happened, they stuffed the body back into a box and waited for a garbage truck to come and carry it off to the landfill, which is what eventually happened. The next day, on May 16th, was when Muk Ching called the police, which ended up leading to this murder being exposed. Some members of the gang on that same day had felt guilty and went to other non-gang members they knew to try and confess and turn themselves in, but nobody believed them and thought that they were just trying to build up a reputation by telling a fake story. Once all was said and done, the police were absolutely floored, since they never even knew Look Chi-wei was missing and only arrested them to talk about Muk Ching, but instead, they all confessed to this murder with little to no prompting from them. In fact, the police struggled to even believe them, likewise thinking that they were lying to build up infamy. Adding to their skepticism was the inconsistent nature of their confessions, with some trying to claim that others did it alone and dragged them into it to share the blame, and others conveniently telling police that they weren't present for Look Chi-wei's actual death and left before. Regardless, the police were obligated to investigate, so they headed to the garbage room in that block of the apartment. Police found 2 plastic pipes, a folding chair, a white blanket, a red bucket, a white gasoline barrel, an electric fan, and a pile of charred debris and signs of a fire. But due to a lack of any human remains at the scene, they still couldn't determine that someone had been killed there. The police afterwards went to the landfill in Takwuling and deployed 120 officers and 4 sniffer dogs, who spent 6 hours searching, but after scouring through several hundreds of tons of garbage and waste, no trace of Look Chi-wei's remains were found. On May 18th, Hin-chun was arrested after his parents compelled and forced him to turn himself in. Hin-chun confessed as well and confirmed to the police that everything said by the others was true. Forensic officials combed through the garbage room and extracted some traces of human tissue from the charred debris and objects. The tissue samples were far too damaged to extract usable DNA samples from and could only be identified as belonging to a child or teenager, and naturally cause of death was impossible to determine based on them alone. This was enough evidence for police that a murder had taken place, and on May 20th they were charged with the murder of Look Chi-wei despite his body remaining missing. The trial also proved to be an issue, as due to the lack of a body and contradicting confessions and later recanted confessions, it was a struggle to figure out who to pin the most blame on. Shi Zijian was granted immunity to murder charges as long as he offered testimony against them, and Muk Ching, due to mental issues he suffered from, was unable to testify in court. The police and prosecutor thus went through and carefully examined every last word of all of their confessions to try and piece together the most likely version of events. This is what they came up with. At 9 p.m. on May 14th, he was called to come to the apartment via a phone call, wanting to discuss something with him. After entering Hui Chi-wei, Mok Kei-ho, Jin Bao and Hin-chun were all waiting. Within seconds of him entering, Hin-chun and Kei-ho instantly punched and kicked him, forcing him to the ground and shouting at him to confess and beg them for mercy. Hin-chun then got a folding chair and opened it to place the legs over his head to stop him from moving. He then grabbed a pair of nunchucks and kept repeatedly hitting him with him and screaming questions at him such as, "Why did you betray us?" But no matter what answer he gave, Hin-chun responded by hitting him again. Afterwards, Hin-chun with some help from Ming-chun picked him up by his legs, holding him upside down with his head pointed towards the ground, and repeatedly slammed the top of his head against the floor in a move they referred to as the human pile driver. Once they were done, he quickly collapsed to the ground, but things weren't over. Chan Tak-ming forced a bunch of dates into his mouth while Jin Bao, Jo Jun, Shi Zijian, Ruan Kit-yi, Liu Pei, Luo Gaifan showed up, having not been present when the beating started. This was also when Luk Jawan was given a brief break while Lin Chun ordered him to mop and clean the floors. During the process, one of the women involved, although who exactly doesn't appear to be stated, slapped Luk Chi-wan and accused him of humiliating her at school, while Pei hit and attacked him with an umbrella to show support. This riled everyone up again, prompting Ming-chun, Chan Tak-ming, Jin Bao and Hin-chun to launch a new wave of assaults, while Luk Jawan was apologizing for encouraging Muk-shing to go to the police and wanting to leave the gang. Despite giving them what they wanted from the start, they still never stopped. Hin-chun then asked Ma Kei-ho for a belt, which he used to continue beating Luk Chi-wei. He hit him with so much force that the buckle broke after only a few blows. Kei-ho blamed Luk Chi-wei for his belt being broken, and together with Shi Zijian they began punching and kicking him all over again. Half an hour later, Hui-chuan returned from his family issues and had a girl with him. He shouted and ordered everyone to stand aside and to watch him deal with Luk Chi-wei on his own. The girl who was with him was frightened and panicked, so the other members sent her away and went with her to see her home, which is why some of the confessions leave out Luk Chi-wei's death. Ma Kei-ho then got a wooden stick and kept hitting him in the back of the neck to force him onto his knees and to kneel in front of a statue of Guanggang to repent. Hui Chi-wei and Chan Tak-ming also repeatedly beat him with their own wooden sticks while he was doing this, as Kei-ho and Jinbo punched and kicked him. By now his body was bruised all over and his feet were starting to bleed, but they didn't let up. Hin-chun then decided to make his torture a poetry recital game. One would be called by their nickname, and when that happened they would repeatedly punch and kick La Chuk-wei on their own. This meant that everybody got to viciously attack him individually at least once, save for Shi Ji-wei. By 10 p.m. they had tired themselves out and started to smoke, and once they were done 3-4 of those involved stuffed the cigarette butts into his mouth. By now Luk Chuk-wei could barely move and begged for mercy and that he couldn't go on for much longer. Shi Ji-wei took him to the bathroom to wash his face, and once they both returned, Ji-wei tried to argue on his behalf and convince him that Luk Jawan had suffered enough. Hin-chun forced him to kneel and apologize again, in spite of him having already done that several times already. He knelt down, but before he could even speak, Chen Ken-gu suddenly kicked him while Ma Kei-ho hit him with a folding chair, with Kei-ho seen smiling as Luk Jawan pleaded for mercy. Louis Chuk-wan joined in, hitting him with a stool and Hin-chun with a wooden stick, causing more and more scars to appear. Soon they took another break. Half an hour later, Xu Ziyong, Ma Kei-ho, Ming-chun, Ruan Kit-yi, Chen Ken-gu and Luo Gaifan all left, while Chan Tak-ming, who had left earlier, returned with 2 plastic pipes, giving one to Hin-chun and Hui-chuan before leaving again. Shi Zijian again brought him to the bathroom to clean him up again and even put his coat on. He then spoke to Hui-chuan and Hin-chun to let him leave with him. In response, Hin-chun said that if he didn't leave right now he would also be made to suffer, so Zijian left while the two began beating him with the plastic pipes. Chan Tak-ming soon returned with his own pipe, resulting in all three beating him with them. Jin Bao then rushed to the kitchen and returned with an iron spatula to join in and beat him too. This continued until he passed out. They responded by dragging him into the bathroom to pour cold water all over him to wake him up so they could continue. They then continued until he passed out and needed to be woken up again. After the third time he passed out, they did everything they could think of to wake him up, but he wouldn't respond to anything. They didn't realize that he had died until 12:30 a.m., where they proceeded to dispose of his body in the manner described above. Once the trial began at the Hong Kong High Court, the main question was how accurate the testimony was, especially from the star witness Shi Zijian, and who delivered the fatal blow if such a question could be answered with no body. The defense for many of the defendants pointed the finger at Ming-chun and accused Zijian of perjury. The lawyer for Hui-chuan even called on a doctor to testify and explain. He testified that all the beatings before 10:30 p.m. likely were not as serious as they were made out to be if Zijian was able to help him change in and out of clothing and hold intelligible conversations with him. He further stated that according to Zijian, when this was happening, Luk Shawan's breath was normal. The attacks with the pipe were mainly centered around his torso and not his head, with the only person who anyone claimed to have struck him on the head with a pipe being Ng-Ming Chun, ergo, he was the one who delivered the finishing blow. The prosecution called upon their own doctor to refute. He argued that the material, length, and hardness of the plastic pipes were not enough to cause fatal wounds, and that whatever killed Luk Chawan likely happened earlier, with it taking some dye for him to die from it. This doctor testified that it wasn't one single blow that caused Luk Chawan's death, and instead, all the injuries accumulated and resulted in a hemorrhage, meaning that all participants shared culpability. It was even argued that he may have still been alive but with a weak pulse while they were putting his body in that box to dispose of. The judge sided with the prosecution and argued that all involved except for Zijian would be charged with murder regardless of how mild they were specifically in their treatment of Luk Chawan. On January 27, 1999, the jury returned with their verdicts. Hui Chawan was found guilty of murder and preventing the burial of a body and was given a life sentence. An appeal court reduced the sentence to 30 years and later 25. Mok Keho was convicted on the same charges and sentenced to 26 years imprisonment. He appealed his sentence, and in May 2001, the appeal court convicted him only of assault and preventing the burial of a body and was given a reduced sentence of 7 years. Ng-Ming Chun was given a life sentence, although an appeal reduced it to 25 years. Ruan Kit-Yi was convicted only of assault and preventing the burial of a body and was given a sentence of 42 months in prison with time served factored in. Chan Tak-Ming was given a life sentence. An appeal court reduced it to 25 years and later 20. Huang Jinbao was convicted of murder and preventing the burial of a body, but due to his young age he was sentenced more leniently, being given a 23-year sentence. An appeals court reduced the sentence to 19 years due to his younger age. Fu Hinchan was sentenced to life, with the judge handing down some harsh words and describing him as beyond redemption. An appeals court reduced it to 30 years and later again to 22. Shi Zijian was only granted immunity from murder charges but not anything else, so he was sentenced to 7 years for manslaughter and preventing the burial of a corpse. Xu Ziyang, Liu Pei, Zhou Jun, Chen Kengu and Luo Gaifan were only convicted of assault and preventing the burial of a body and given 21-month sentences. However, due to time served, they left court after these sentences were handed down. The sentences were all appealed and accepted because the defense lawyers and presiding judge neglected sentencing guidelines for those who were juveniles at the time of the offense. All have since been released and are now free, with the exception of Liu Pei, who committed suicide via jumping off a building on December 25, 2007. To this day, Luk Chawan's body has never been discovered, and his disappearance would have likely remained unsolved had Chan Muk-ching not gathered up the courage to make that 999 call about his assault and injuries. In 2015, Heather Saul shot and killed a man who tried to rape her after she managed to grab his gun away from him. When police arrived to investigate the shooting, they found an enormous kill kit in the deceased man's car. They would later credit Heather with stopping an active serial killer. In 2015, a prostitute/escort named Heather Saul met with a man named Neil Falls. They'd spoken online before, but this was the first time they met in real life. However, Neil attacked Heather almost immediately after entering her house. It's unclear if he was invited in or if he broke in. Either way, Heather ended up in a fight for her life. Neil grabbed her neck and squeezed it hard, telling her that he'd kill her if she didn't do as she was told. With his other hand, he pointed a gun at her. Heather managed to slip away momentarily, and a fight ensued. As Heather fought with Neil, she realized that he wasn't going to shoot her. He actually wanted to keep her alive, at least in the short term. Once Heather realized that Neil wouldn't shoot her, she was able to fight back more effectively. She grabbed a small rake from her kitchen, the kind used to clean up dog poop. Heather swung the rake at Neil. This turned out to be the best thing she could have done, because Neil set down his gun so he could use both hands to grab the rake away from her. As soon as she saw that, Heather let the rake get pulled away from her and dove for the gun instead. She immediately shot Neil in the head as soon as it was in her hands. The whole encounter, from the time Neil entered the house to the time he was shot, lasted less than a few minutes. Many people in town would later call her Heather the hero for her actions that night, but Heather didn't feel like a hero. She felt sick. She'd never wanted to kill anybody, she never asked for this. When police showed up, she was sobbing hysterically. She was also injured. She had a broken back and dislocated shoulder from her fight with Neil. This was by far the most traumatic experience of Heather's entire life. She cried profusely throughout her interview with detectives. When a police officer searched Neil's deceased body, he found 4 pairs of handcuffs. Right away that was seen as a red flag. A search of Neil Falls' car revealed an enormous kill kit. In Neil Falls' vehicle, Police found an axe, a shovel, a sledgehammer, Bowie knives, bleach, cleaning supplies, handcuffs, duct tape, guns, and a bulletproof vest. "It's likely that Mr. Falls is a serial killer," said Steve Cooper, Charleston Police Department Chief of Detectives. "I believe she saved lives by shooting Mr. Falls, based on what he did to her and based on the items found in his car." It would eventually be confirmed that Neil Falls had kidnapped, tortured, and killed at least several other women before he met Heather. Janet Chandler, 22 years old. Michigan woman is killed at a surprise party held for her by security guards, where she is raped and tortured to death. After a few days, she is found buried in a snowbank by a snowplow driver. 25 years later, 6 people are arrested and charged for her murder. Janet Chandler, a 22-year-old woman, was found deceased on February 1, 1979. A snowplow driver found her nude body buried in the snow near a wooded area. She was completely buried in the snow except for her arm, which jutted out of the snow in an unsettling manner. Janet had been raped, anally and vaginally. Her cause of death was strangulation, and there were bruises over her wrists which indicated that she'd been handcuffed for a prolonged period of time. Adhesive consistent with duct tape was found all over her face, suggesting that she'd been gagged and blindfolded. At the time of her murder, Janet had been living in Ottawa County, Michigan. Specifically, she was living in the city of Holland, which at the time was undergoing some turmoil. A company called Chemitron had a paint plant in Holland, but the workers had gone on strike and the situation was getting ugly. Chemitron hired a security company called Walkenhut to provide additional security during the strike. Walkenhut brought in security personnel from throughout the country to guard the Chemitron plant during the strike. Most of those personnel ended up being housed at the Blue Mill Inn, where Janet Chandler worked as a night clerk. Around 80 security guards from Walkenhut were living at the Blue Mill Inn at the time that Janet was working there. Janet herself lived in an apartment with Laurie Swank, her boss at the Blue Mill Inn. Janet considered Laurie to be her best friend. The Walkenhut guards were known as rough guys that liked to party, and it was common for motel staff to hook up with them. Both Janet Chandler and Laurie Swank indulged in numerous affairs with various guards. In fact, Swank once had to reprimand Janet for having sex in a motel room at the Blue Mill Inn, which was meant to be a display suite. Janet was studying music at Hope College, a private Christian liberal arts school in Holland, Michigan. Janet came from a conservative Christian family, and she was devoutly religious. Before moving into her own apartment, she'd lived a very sheltered life. For example, her parents would not let her sleep over at any friend's house if the friend's parents even drank alcohol. Her teachers at Hope College described her as an emotionally sensitive person who would often burst into tears if she was criticized. Janet seemed too sheltered for her own good. Janet mostly inherited her parents' religious views, and her journals are filled with musings of a religious nature. For example, the last journal entry before her death contained the question, "When was Paul saved? When the Lord spoke to him to go? Or when he obeyed God and went?" Janet had her first sexual encounter when she was 17 with a middle-aged man who was much older than her. Twice a week, she'd sneak him into her parents' house to have sex. The man later expressed regret over this relationship, saying that he'd taken advantage of her naivety and seduced her. Still, the incident was apparently a kind of sexual awakening for Janet. She figured that God wouldn't send her to hell just for having some fun occasionally. One night, Janet was working her night job at the Blue Inn when suddenly she was confronted by a maid who accused Janet of sleeping with the maid's boyfriend, one of the Walkenhut security guards. Janet had phoned his room, telling him to come to the front desk right away. When he got there, he was surprised to find Janet there waiting for him, completely naked. Janet then escorted him to an empty room where the two had sex. Needless to say, the maid wasn't happy when she found out about this little stunt. When she angrily confronted Janet, the ensuing argument could be heard throughout the hotel as the two women screamed at each other. This incident with the maid was apparently the final straw for Arthur Paiva, the lead guard from Walkenhut. Paiva was irritated that Janet kept having so many romantic trysts with his security personnel. This was somewhat hypocritical of him, since he'd also had sex with Janet at least once. He became even more furious with Janet after Laurie Swank, Janet's boss and roommate, took it upon herself to inform him of Janet's most recent escapades. Laurie apparently was jealous of Janet's many romantic flings with the various guards, basically just because Janet was more popular. Or something like that. I honestly can't figure out why exactly they all decided that Janet needed to be destroyed. Maybe it was of jealousy, or maybe it was because Janet was too religious for their liking. But whatever the precise motive, Laurie and the others developed a hatred towards Janet, and they wanted Janet to be taken down a few notches. Paiva assured Lori that he had a plan to deal with Janet. He told Swank that he and a few other guards were planning a surprise party for Janet. They were going to humiliate Janet for acting like a whore. Paiva told her that the guards were going to pass Janet around to teach her a lesson. The evil plan was put into action during the winter of 1979. Janet was working her night job at the front desk of the Blue Mill Inn, as usual. But on that night, she was visited by Robert Lynch, a security guard from Wackenhut, who told her that they were throwing a surprise party in her honor. He wrapped gauze over her eyes and then covered her eyes with duct tape. She did not resist. She believed that she was going to a party and that people were doing something nice for her. Janet was taken to a guest house near the Chemitron plant. The guest house was where Arthur Pavia lived. He didn't live at the Blue Mill Inn with the other guards. As soon as Robert Lynch dropped Janet off at the house, she was forcibly stripped, gagged, and handcuffed. For the next 17 hours, Janet would be humiliated, raped, and tortured until she was dead. Her tormentors included at least 10 men and about half as many women. At first, it seemed like the goal was only to humiliate Janet, albeit in an extraordinarily cruel manner. She was paraded throughout the house while she was blindfolded, gagged, handcuffed, and fully nude. All the while, the others got drunk and partied around her. They teased Janet and taunted her about the ordeal, telling her that she was getting what she deserved. A belt was wrapped around her neck in such a manner that pulling on the end of it would cause the belt to constrict around Janet's neck. This was used as a way to control Janet. Whenever she would try to resist or fight back in any way, the end of the belt would be pulled to restrict her breathing. After they were done parading her around, Janet was tied down to a bed. That is when the brutality truly began. One by one, all of the men at the party took turns beating and raping Janet while she was tied down to the bed and handcuffed. While she was being raped, the others would verbally abuse her and cheer on the rapists. They would yell things like "You're going too easy on her" or "Fuck her to death." Lori was among those in the cheering section. She called Janet a bitch and yelled at her that she deserved everything that was happening. Cheryl Ruiz, the maid who'd been angry at Janet before the murder, was also present. While this was going on, Arthur Paiva used a camera to take pictures while the rapes were happening. These pictures would be his insurance policy. He wanted to be sure that nobody who was at the party would be able to turn on the others without incriminating themselves. The abuse of Janet Chandler would continue without respite until she was dead. Robert Lynch was the one who ultimately killed Janet. He was much older than all the others. He was 39 at the time of the murder, whereas the others were all in their early 20s. While he was raping Janet, he'd grabbed hold of the belt around her neck and pulled it so tight that it killed her through strangulation. When the others realized that Janet was dead, they panicked. Paiva yelled out, "This party is fucking over." The participants then scrambled to clean up the house and find a way to dispose of her body. Ultimately, Janet was tossed into a snowbank 40 miles away from the guest house. That is where she was eventually discovered. Paiva made certain to tell every single person present that he had photographs of them being involved, so nobody could tell on the others without incriminating themselves. And for over 20 years, that was enough to prevent anybody from talking. After the savage murder of Janet Chandler, the various participants simply moved on with their lives, although they all lived in fear that one day the world would discover what they'd done to Janet. After attending Janet's funeral, Lori Swank moved to Pennsylvania where she worked as a nursing assistant. Robert Lynch got married and opened up a cosmetology school with his wife, with whom he had 2 kids. The Wackenhut security guards simply went home when the Chemitron strike was over, dispersing throughout the country. And so basically, they all got away with it. For over 20 years, nobody was arrested for the death of Janet Chandler. And if not for some meddling kids at Hope College, they may never have been caught. In 2003, a group of film students at Hope College, the Christian liberal arts school where Janet Chandler had been studying music, decided that they would give it their best shot. David Schock, the professor leading the project, cautioned them that it wasn't realistic for them to believe that they could solve the mystery. Rather, the goal of the project was to revive the memory of Janet Chandler in hopes of getting people talking again. The group of film students made a documentary about the murder of Janet Chandler, simply titled "Who Killed Janet Chandler?" The film premiered in 2004 and had a limited run in local theaters. The documentary succeeded in reviving the memory of Janet Chandler and it got law enforcement to reopen the case. The film would succeed even beyond the most optimistic hopes of its creators. Within 3 years, arrests would be made. While making the film, the students attempted to track down everybody who knew Chandler to interview them. They interviewed her parents, her teachers, and many of the cops who'd been involved in the original investigation. Nearly all the cops interviewed said that they were haunted by the unsolved murder and that it was the biggest regret of their lives that they weren't able to solve it. One of the people they wanted to interview for the documentary was Lori Swank, Chandler's roommate. They kept asking around, but nobody could seem to know what had happened to her. It took them a long time, but eventually they did find her in Pennsylvania. When Swank spoke to the film students, she warmly described Janet as musical and fun-loving. When police reopened the case in 2004, they made it a priority to re-interview many of the walk-in hut guards, even though most of them no longer lived in Michigan. One of the people they interviewed was Robert Lynch. By this point, he was 65 years old and he had 2 children of his own, including a 22-year-old daughter. Outwardly, Robert appeared to be a normal 65-year-old man, except for his extreme alcoholism. Robert drank like crazy whenever he could, as if he was desperately trying to forget something. The investigators sensed that Robert knew more than he was saying, so they kept coming back to him. After multiple visits, he finally started to crack and open up about what really happened. When he first started opening up, he told investigators that right before the murder, Janet had been at a party that went haywire. This immediately caught the attention of investigators. They'd been interviewing people for over a year since the investigation was reopened and this was the first time they'd ever heard anyone mention a party. But when they tried to get more information, Robert clammed up again. He said that he'd only heard about the party secondhand. Still, they kept coming back to him. The big breakthrough came when the detectives pulled out a copy of the documentary Who Killed Janet Chandler? And had him watch it with them. As they watched the movie together, Robert started crying. He said that he regretted his entire life. He started telling investigators everything that he knew, this time honestly. He admitted that he and a number of other security guards had raped and murdered Janet at a surprise party. He insisted that killing her wasn't intentional, but he also understood that it doesn't really matter if it was intentional or not. Robert gave up the names of the others who'd been involved: Arthur Paiva, Freddie Parker, Anthony Williams, and James Nelson. But investigators were most surprised to hear that Lori Swank had been there and she'd cheered on the gang rape as it was happening. When investigators confronted Lori Swank with this new information, she finally broke and admitted that she'd been involved in the murder. Ultimately, Swank agreed to testify against the others in exchange for being allowed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. But perhaps most importantly, when police searched Paiva's home, they were able to find the rape photos that he'd used to blackmail the others into silence for so many years. The trial began in 2007. Paiva, Parker, Williams, and Nelson were all tried together. Robert Lynch and Lori Swank testified against all 4 of them. Another person who testified at the trial was Cheryl Ruiz, the hotel maid who'd been upset with Janet before the murder. Janet had slept with Cheryl's boyfriend and so she was happy, at first, to see that Janet was finally getting punished for her constant sleeping around. However, she later testified that she'd had no idea that it was going to go so far or that Janet would end up dead. "I didn't think it was going to be this rough. I didn't think they were going to go to this extreme," Ruiz testified. Ruiz was told that if she ever told anybody about what she saw that night, then she'd end up just like Janet Chandler. And so for almost 30 years, she said nothing. She did end up telling her parents about what happened, but they told her to stay out of it, saying that she could be arrested if anybody ever found out what happened. It wasn't until Arthur Paiva was finally put on trial in 2007 that Ruiz broke her silence. During the trial, Ruiz also claimed that the defendants, Paiva, Parker, Williams, and Nelson, would make surprise visits to her house for years after the murder, to threaten her and remind her that if she ever spoke up about what happened at the party, she'd end up just like Janet. Paiva was found guilty of first-degree murder. The others were found guilty of second-degree murder. All 4 were sentenced to life in prison without parole. After the convictions, the prosecution said that they believed that others were also involved in the death of Janet Chandler, but it is unlikely that any more arrests will be made. This case was among the most expensive in Michigan history, costing close to $2 million to investigate and prosecute. Bill Cosby raped and/or sexually assaulted over 60 women. After 3 years, he was released due to a violation of his rights on self-incrimination, leaving at least 60 women with no path to justice. Here are some details of his crimes. Bill Cosby always carefully cultivated a public image of himself as a wholesome comedian who didn't use profanity and was a positive role model for young black men. In public he lectured against rap music, saggy pants, and other perceived societal ills, while in private he was carrying on a decades-long career as a sexual abuser and rapist. Until Newsweek, Gawker, and comedian Hannibal Buress brought this story back to the forefront in 2014, Bill Cosby had been able to use his power, money, and influence to keep the general public from knowing about his depravity and his crimes. On October 16, 2014, Hannibal Buress said the following at a stand-up routine in Philadelphia. "And it's even worse because Bill Cosby has the fucking smuggest old black man public persona that I hate. Pull your pants up, black people. I was on TV in the 80s. I can't talk down to you because I had a successful sitcom. Yeah, but you raped women, Bill Cosby. So, brings you down a couple notches. I don't curse on stage. Well, yeah, you're a rapist, so, I'll take you saying lots of motherfuckers on Bill Cosby himself. If you weren't a rapist, I wanted to just at least make it weird for you to watch Cosby Show reruns. I've done this bit on stage, and people don't believe. People think I'm making it up. That shit is upsetting. If you didn't know about it, trust me. You leave here and Google Bill Cosby rape. It's not funny. That shit has more results than Hannibal Buress." Even though Cosby had accusations going back to the 1970s and an article in People magazine in 2006, he was able to use his power and money to bully these women into not going to authorities. Ultimately 60 women would accuse him of sexual assault or rape. Days before that People piece hit, Cosby had settled a lawsuit with Andrea Constand, an operations manager for the women's basketball team at Temple University, an institution to which Cosby had extra special ties. Constand alleged that Cosby invited her to his Cheltenham home, gave her pills when she complained she was stressed and, after she got dizzy, began touching her breast and placing her hand on his penis. Constand's criminal case against Cosby never progressed due to lack of evidence, and in November of 2006 Cosby settled with Constand in a civil case she brought. The next month People published their piece with the accounts of other women who had come forward after Andrea Constand had. It was revealed that 2 of the women had gone on to form consensual relationships with him and that he had made payments to 3 of them for years. And that's where things stood until 2014, when Newsweek, Gawker, and Hannibal Buress brought this story back to the forefront. Bill Cosby had an MO. He would invite women to his home where he would drug them and assault them. In some cases the women had no memory of what had happened. In many others they reported they were drugged, but awake and powerless to stop him. Then he would use his position as a celebrity to threaten them with a potential blackballing if they were to report him. Many of his victims were women trying to get their start in show business and felt stripped of agency due to his status. Lisa, one of Cosby's victims, reported that in 1988 she went to a hotel room to run lines with Cosby. He talked about, "Let me see what type of acting skills you have, I want you to improv." And as I tried to do improv, he fixed a drink and then he brought it to me. It was a brown liquid and it looked like a shot. I told him I didn't drink. He said that this was going to relax me so that the lines would flow out a lot easier. So I had to drink it. He made a second drink and had me drink the second drink as well. I noticed myself getting a little dizzy. Bill had sat down on the edge of the couch. He said, "Come over here and have a seat." He had his legs open and when I sat down, I was sitting down in between his legs with my back to his crotch. He started to stroke my hair back in a petting motion, like this. The last things I remember is just feeling the strokes on my head. After that I don't remember anything else. 2 days later she woke up in her own bed. One of the other women who came forward, Margie Shapiro, said that in 1975 Cosby took her to the Playboy Mansion where they played some pinball, and Cosby challenged her to a wager, saying whoever lost would swallow a pill, she claimed. "I said sure, why not, since he was still not being malicious or anything," Shapiro said. "She lost a game, took a pill and quickly blacked out," she said. "I came to a little and the first thing I saw was Bill Cosby's face not far above me and we were both naked," she said. "He was inside me and touching me and I was so grossed out, I can't find the words to express my disgust." In 2016, after a deposition from the Constand civil trial was unsealed in which Cosby admitted he used quaaludes he got from his crooked gynecologist to drug women, a judge ruled that he must stand trial. All told, 60 women would come forward to accuse Cosby of rape or sexual assault. A woman who thought Cosby was going to offer her a spot on The Cosby Show said that Cosby invited her to his house in NYC for a private audition, she said, then offered her a drink to calm her nerves and had her spin around as an exercise. "Within seconds I began to vomit all over myself and his rug. I felt ashamed," Dottie said. "Things got foggy thereafter, but I do know he took my clothes off and put them in his washing machine. I don't remember too much of the shower, or walking back down the steps back to the second floor," she said. The next thing she remembers was being dressed in a robe, with Cosby pushing against a chest in his hallway. She says he lifted the robe and raped her, eventually moving her to the dining room floor. She said he helped her get dressed, then showed her out. Bill Cosby called me the next day, not to see how I was, but for phone sex. She claimed. He tried to get me to do it, but I was no longer under the influence of what I thought was only alcohol. Cosby was committing so many of these rapes and assaults that he surely lost track of all of them, as evidenced in this interaction from flight attendant Colleen Hughes, who said that, according to Hughes, the two went to her hotel room so she could shower and change clothes, and, when she emerged, Cosby had ordered champagne and appetizers. Hughes claimed that Cosby was drinking champagne out of her shoe. There were also glasses of champagne, Hughes said, and Cosby handed her one. The last thing Hughes claimed to remember was Cosby attempting to hold her hand, after which she woke up hours later. My clothes were thrown all over the room and I felt semen on the small of my back and all over me, Hughes said. Bill obviously did not use a condom and there was no lunch and he was nowhere to be seen. Hughes claimed that, approximately a year later, she encountered Cosby on another flight. When she reminded the comedian of the alleged incident, Hughes said, Cosby turned pale and said, "Did you ever report that to anyone?" She replied that she had not. Another woman recounted that Cosby ascribed special properties to certain bodily fluids. In another incident, Cosby gloated over her humiliation after forcibly shoving his penis in her mouth and ejaculating on her face. I felt Cosby's left hand gently grab my long hair behind my head. His giant frame blocked the door so if anyone should try to enter, they would not be able to see what he was doing, White Deer told reporters. When Cosby was done, there was a horrible mess of semen all over my face, my clothes and in my hair. He took out a Kleenex to try to wipe off my face. I was bordering between vomiting and passing out. He was mumbling that I had been blessed with his semen, like holy water. Another piece of information that came out as a result of the unsealing of the 2005 deposition was that Cosby did what any other run-of-the-mill abuser does, and he specifically targeted women who were from out of town, didn't have any money, and badly wanted to break into show business. That dynamic created an entry for Cosby to abuse women and then cover it up with cash gifts. Age was not even a boundary for Cosby, as there were two specific incidents where abuse occurred with a minor. A 17-year-old model moved to New York City after an appeal by Cosby to an agency to find girls who were not financially doing well, and were from out of town. He promised my parents he'd take care of me. The first time I met him, I had tears in my eyes, she told People last year under a pseudonym. Thompson revealed her real name in March, as further accusations against Cosby mounted. Her parents agreed to let her move to New York only because of Cosby's assurances he'd take care of her, she said. But it became clear to her that Cosby had more in mind than nurturing a young actress's career. He said, "Get that magazine, pick an outfit and I'll get you that outfit. You'll wear that outfit and we'll go out to a nice dinner. And then you can come back here," she told People, "and you can have amaretto, your favorite, and you'll be tired so you can just stay here and sleep on the couch." Eventually, she said, Cosby pressured her for sex at his home, and she reluctantly gave him a handjob. She said he gave her $700 before she left. He responded in the deposition that any touching he'd done had been consensual. He later called her parents to offer cash in the form of an educational trust to make the accusations go away. The offer to pay for school is one that Cosby would use again and again. He used the same device on Andrea Constant, telling her parents he would pay for the rest of her education. Cosby was indiscriminate. He even attempted to rape supermodel Beverly Johnson, who managed to escape by calling Cosby a motherfucker, and he did assault Janice Dickinson, another model. In her account, detailed here, she explains that her experience at parties as a supermodel in the 70s allowed her to recognize instantly that she had been drugged. When she lashed out at Cosby, calling him a motherfucker, it must have struck a nerve with him. He violently grabbed her and pushed her out the front door and flagged down a taxi. Maybe the worst thing Cosby did was take a 15-year-old girl to the Playboy Mansion, give her alcohol, and sexually assault her way back in 1974. She alleged that, while at the Playboy Mansion, Cosby directed her to a bathroom within a bedroom suite near the game room. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found him sitting on the bed. He asked her to sit beside him. He then proceeded to sexually molest her by attempting to put his hand down her pants and then taking her hand in his hand and masturbating himself. The rest of the story pretty much follows a pattern. Bill Cosby used his fame, money, and power in whatever combination necessary to persuade women to just accept what had happened to them and not to embarrass him publicly. In 2005, the prosecution found there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute him at the time. A civil case was filed instead. Viewing the civil case as a better path to achieve justice, The prosecutor told Cosby that he would agree not to file charges if Cosby would come clean in a deposition and tell the truth. The prosecutor agreed not to use his statements against him. In 2015, a different prosecutor filed charges and used Cosby's testimony against him in contradiction to the previous agreement. On June 30, 2021, a panel of judges found that Cosby's constitutional rights against self-incrimination had been violated and he was released from prison after serving 3 years. The statute of limitations has long expired on many of his cases, meaning that Cosby will likely be free from accountability and punishment for his crimes, leaving 60 women, and surely many others, with no path to justice and closure. The brutal attack on Mary Vincent. In September of 1978, Mary Vincent was on her way to Los Angeles. She was 15 years old and had run away from home. As she held up a sign that read "Heading South" while she walked along the freeway, she was hoping this would be the start of a promising dance career. A man named Lawrence Singleton stopped to pick her up and she accepted the ride, although feeling a little uncomfortable since he said there's only room for her in his vehicle, not for the 2 other teens waiting for a ride as well. Singleton made his young passenger feel comfortable right away. Vincent felt so at ease with this kindly, old man that before long she fell asleep. When Vincent awoke, she realized they were going the wrong way. Her efforts to alert Singleton of the error resulted in excuses and reassurances from Singleton. They eventually came to a stop at a rest area for a bathroom break. Vincent was beginning to feel uneasy about the situation, so when she saw her shoe untied, she hopped out of the car to tie it should she need to make a run for it. Before she knew what was happening, Vincent crumpled to the ground. Singleton had hit her over the head with a sledgehammer. She awoke tied up in the back of the van. Each arm was fastened to the opposite side of the van wall. Singleton would sexually assault her again and again over the course of the night. The next morning, Vincent begged for her release. Singleton replied, "If you want to be set free, I'll set you free." He then proceeded to hack off both of her arms with an axe. Vincent was slipping in and out of consciousness now. She could barely tell what was going on as Singleton tossed her over the edge of a 30-foot cliff into Del Puerto Canyon. Nude, badly hurt, and unbelievably traumatized, Vincent almost let the demise tugging at the edge of her consciousness take over. As she thought about the other girls who might fall into the hands of Singleton should she not report him though, she realized she had to fight to survive. With nothing but bloody stumps for arms, Vincent managed to climb back up the cliff and make her way back to the road. The car she managed to flag down for help saw Vincent holding up her severed arms. She was trying to make sure the muscles didn't fall out of her arms and to prevent any further blood loss. The Good Samaritan brought Vincent to a nearby hospital where they frantically worked to save her life. Mary would go on to generate a detailed composite sketch and description of her attacker, and which would go on to be recognized by a neighbor of Larry's. He would be arrested and put on trial for his attack on Mary Vincent. 6 months later, Mary would be staring down her attacker in court where her testimony successfully put him behind bars. Unfortunately, he would only be sentenced to 14 years. The judge presiding over the court remarked, "If I had the power, I would send him to prison for the rest of his natural life." Larry would go on to stun absolutely no one by admitting he whispered the following to Mary while in court, "I'll finish this job, if it takes me the rest of my life." Mary and the public were understandably upset over the sentence, feeling it too short and unjust. This would lead to the passing of the Singleton Bill, which ceases the early release of criminals who use torture in their crime and allowed for a 25 to life sentences as well. Larry Singleton would go on to serve only 8 years on a 14-year sentence based on his good behavior and performing his job well as a teacher's aide in prison. Larry would eventually be allowed to move back to his native state of Florida, where he would continue to get into trouble. In 1990, he would be convicted of theft twice, serving a 60-day sentence. Both theft charges were for small, inexpensive objects. February 19, 1997. Tampa, Florida. A local house painter had noticed a horrific scene unfolding inside a nearby residence. He quickly called police and described to them the disturbing details. A nude man, covered in blood, was repeatedly stabbing a nude woman who lay motionless on the sofa. He would claim to the 911 caller that he could hear the bones being crunched after each stab. The nude man, who just continued on with his stabbing frenzy, was none other than Larry Singleton. The victim was 31-year-old Roxanne Hayes. She was a mother of 3 and doing what she could to support her family. She had agreed to meet with Larry for $20. Larry would go on to claim that she tried to take more than the agreed-upon amount from his wallet. A struggle ensued. While he was trying to get a knife from her, she wound up being stabbed multiple times. His story is clearly made up due to the testimony of the house painter. An unconscious victim cannot struggle with a killer. Shortly after the incident, Larry would attempt to take his own life but was unsuccessful, He would be housed in a psychiatric hospital for some time before heading to jail to await trial. Mary would fly from California to Florida to testify on behalf of Roxanne and to ensure this would never happen again. She would go into great detail what happened to her and paint a very clear picture why the ultimate punishment should be handed down to Singleton. "I was raped. I had my arms cut off. He used a hatchet. He left me to die." Singleton's defense claimed that he never meant to kill Roxanne, that it was just a mistake due to too much emotion at the time. It took the jury 4 hours to come to a decision of guilty. On April 14, 1998, Singleton was given a death sentence for the senseless and horrific murder of Roxanne Hayes. Singleton appeared to not care when Judge Anderson passed down the sentence on him. This was an unprovoked, senseless killing of a human being. We are living in times worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. December 28, 2001. Singleton was serving his sentence, and awaiting his death when he died at the age of 74 from cancer. Many believe Mary and Roxanne were not Larry Singleton's only victims, that he could be responsible for as many as a dozen murders. "My cousin was raped, tortured, and murdered in her own home." Social media made it political, subsequently it was marked as fake news. Last month, my cousin Saswati Jana, a 20-year-old honors nutrition student, was raped, tortured, and murdered by construction workers in her own home in Midnapur, West Bengal, India. Elements on social media misuse the news for political propaganda. Due to the false politicization given to the crime, it was marked as fake news, and never spread. There are people denying that the horrible crime even took place, due to the lack of coverage. Why else would the brutal rape and murder of an innocent, young girl in her own home not make the national and even international news? This is crime not common at all for this area. Our family wants the perpetrators to be tried in court and be held accountable for this heinous crime. Unfortunately, the crime has been completely swept under the rug by the media and hardly reported on. Without national and international pressure, justice in the country moves very slowly. We have been told that in order to get justice we have to be vocal, gather public support, and get this news to the mainstream media. Her story should not be forgotten. She, a women's magazine, recently did an interview with me, https://esha.in/2021/06/06/Jamna Midnapur West Bengal student rape murder case/ I encourage you all to read it. It goes into detail of how the crime was planned, calculated, and likely executed out before. It also emphasizes that there was no political angle. I originally shared this post somewhere else, and received several comments to post it here in the True Crime sub to bring awareness to the issue. There is a large fear of justice not being served as well as the culprits committing this crime again. We are using #JusticeForSaswati on social media to increase awareness and media coverage. My family in the US created a website for her since her family in India lacks a lot of resources. This way we can give her a voice as the perpetrators deprived her of that. http://justiceforsaswati.org/ There is also a petition for her, free to sign, https://www.change.org/p/Ministry of Women and Child Development Justice for Saswati Jana. Thank you to the mods for approving sharing the links. Our family is very welcoming of any advice and tips on how to handle this situation. We feel helpless. We are beyond devastated and heartbroken. Support via solidarity is also welcome. In 2001, two brothers, 13-year-old Derek King and 12-year-old Alex King, killed their father and set their house on fire. Derek and Alex's mother and father, Kelly Marino and Terry King, met in 1985. They had Derek in 1988 and Alex in 1989. Their mother left in 1993, when her oldest sons were 5 and 6, and had twin boys with someone else. Both boys were handed between relatives and foster care. The brothers were separated when Derek was moved to a school principal and Alex was placed in state care. In 2001, Alex moved back in with his father and Derek was moved back to his father when the family he was staying with found his behavior being too disruptive for them. While staying with their father, they met a friend of their father named Ricky Chavez, who was convicted of molesting two 13-year-old boys. The boys liked Ricky because they smoked marijuana and played video games. Eventually, Ricky convinced Alex to have a sexual relationship with him. Really, it was a pedophile being a pedophile and taking advantage of a 12-year-old child who doesn't know any better. In November of 2001, Terry was sleeping in his recliner. Derek said that Alex suggested that they kill their father, so the 13-year-old beat their father with an aluminum baseball bat. They then set their house on fire to cover it up. Apparently, they did this because they were convinced by Ricky that if they killed their father, the children would stay with him. In the original testimony, The predator picked the 12-year-old and 13-year-old up, washed their clothes, and hid them from the police. After they arrested the brothers, they found Alex's diary where he confessed his love for Ricky, a man 30 years older than him. After they changed their stories a few times, in 2002, the boys were charged as adults. After pleading to third-degree murder and arson, Derek was sentenced to 8 years in prison and Alex was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The predator was convicted as being an accessory to murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison and scheduled to be released in 2033. Their mother, Kelly, spoke with the press, saying that her sons didn't understand the seriousness of their situation and said that they think that they're going to a playground. They really do. They think they're going to be with other children. Prosecutor David Rimmer retorted by saying that her sons wouldn't be facing prison sentences if she paid more attention to them. In 2005, Alex was charged with trying to escape from his juvenile prison. In 2008, Alex was released and in 2009, Derek was released. After their prison release, they stayed at a sanctuary for kids who killed their parents and both brothers had help from many people from outside of prison. In February 2011, Alex was involved in a car accident and fled on foot. He received a 3-year prison sentence and was released in 2013. Rachel Timmerman, 19 years old. Michigan woman is kidnapped and raped in the woods after a card party. She manages to escape, only to end up in jail herself. When she is released from jail, the rapist kidnaps her again and kills Rachel by drowning her in a lake with cinder blocks. Rachel Timmerman, a 19-year-old woman, was found deceased on July 5, 1997. She was found in Oxford Lake in Newaygo County, Michigan. Rachel's legs were bound with chains that were wrapped around cinder blocks, her arms were handcuffed behind her back. Her eyes and mouth were covered with duct tape, meaning that she'd been gagged and blindfolded. Her autopsy revealed that she'd been alive at the time she entered the lake. Her cause of death was drowning. Rachel was weighted down by over 60 pounds, 27.2 kilograms, worth of chains and cinder blocks. Despite this, she had somehow made her way to the surface of Oxford Lake. When a human body decomposes, bacteria inside the body produce gas. This gas can become trapped inside the body if it is submerged, causing the body to become buoyant and rise to the surface. It seems unbelievable, but that is apparently what happened in this case. After several weeks underwater, enough gas built up inside Rachel that she rose to the surface. The water of Oxford Lake is less than 1 meter in depth, but underneath the water there is a thick layer of soft mud. When Rachel was underwater, her body was completely submerged into the mud. It would have been impossible to find her even if you were intentionally looking for a body in the lake. It is only because she rose to the surface that Rachel was eventually found. Before her disappearance, Rachel had been scheduled to testify at the trial of Marvin Gabriel. Marvin was being charged with third-degree sexual assault because Rachel had accused him of rape. His preliminary hearing was set for June 5, 1997 and Rachel was supposed to testify at that hearing. However, Rachel mysteriously vanished just a few days before the preliminary hearing was set to commence. Part 1, Rachel Goes to Jail. The horrible story begins on August 6, 1996. At the time, Rachel was living in Cedar Springs, a small town in Michigan. Rachel had an unlikely friendship with a man named Wayne Davis. A disabled veteran who walked with a pronounced limp, he really could not have been more different from Rachel. Wayne had a metal plate in his head from getting shot in Vietnam and he suffered from post-traumatic stress. He never went anywhere without his M65 Army field jacket, which he often joked was the only thing keeping his thin body from falling apart. Rachel and Wayne drank together and played cards frequently. Wayne was one of those people who seems to make new friends without any effort. Police reports would later even say that he had an unusually wide circle of friends. On August 6, Rachel received a call from Wayne Davis. He asked her to come play cards. Just 6 weeks earlier, Rachel had given birth to her infant daughter, Shannon. She was eager to go out and be with friends. She convinced her sister, Sarah, to babysit Shannon so she could go out and have some fun. For weeks, she'd been stuck inside her mom's home doing nothing but taking care of the baby. This was her chance to escape for a bit. Around 9 p.m., Rachel walked over to Wayne's home, where she was the only female among a group of drunken men. They all hung out, drinking, playing cards, and smoking marijuana for a while. Later, they were joined by one of Wayne's other friends, Marvin Gabriel and Marvin's nephew, Mikey. At this time, Mikey Gabriel was approximately 14 years old. Eventually, Rachel decided that it was time to go home. She and Wayne left the home and started walking towards Rachel's home. But Marvin stopped them and insisted on driving her home in his car. Marvin's nephew, Mikey, was also in the car. He wouldn't take no for an answer. But when they got to Rachel's house, Marvin didn't stop to let her out, he kept driving down the road. Soon after passing Rachel's home, Marvin pulled over to the side of a road and told Wayne and Mikey to get out. When they protested, Marvin told them to get the fuck out or else. Wayne was too drunk to resist and Mikey was too young to resist. After the two exited the vehicle, Marvin drove off with Rachel still in the car. He took her to an isolated wilderness road. Marvin dragged Rachel out of the car and tried to force himself on her. She fought back furiously, biting and kicking as hard as possible. He reacted by beating her into submission. He punched Rachel in the face and smashed her head against the ground multiple times, disorienting her. Marvin also bit Rachel's nose, causing it to bleed profusely. He kept beating her until she lost the will to resist. At that point, he pulled off Rachel's pants and raped her. He threatened Rachel that if she ever told anybody about what happened, he would kill her infant daughter, Shannon, right in front of her and make her watch. Rachel was terrified that Marvin would kill her and leave her out in the woods, never to be found. She came up with an idea to get Marvin to take to her house. She started pretending to enjoy what was happening. She told Marvin that she wanted to keep going, but someplace more comfortable than the forest. Rachel suggested her bed at her mother's home. Marvin was pleasantly surprised by her sudden enthusiasm. "I knew you were a slut," he said, "I could tell just looking at you." But when they got to Rachel's home, they didn't crawl into bed to have sex together like Rachel had suggested. Instead, Rachel ran inside, ahead of Marvin, and then locked the door behind her. Realizing that he'd been tricked, Marvin furiously pounded on the front door. "You'll pay for this, bitch," he shouted. Sarah awoke to find Rachel's face covered in blood. Rachel grabbed the best weapon she could find nearby, which turned out to be a claw hammer. She held the hammer like a club, ready to strike if Marvin tried to break in. Marvin kept banging on the door and Rachel shouted at him to leave. Wayne Davis and Mikey Gabriel were also there, although they were asleep when Rachel entered the home. The commotion woke them up as well. Outnumbered, Marvin retreated from the encounter. Rachel's mom called an ambulance soon after Marvin left. A rape test was done on Rachel and DNA was collected from Rachel's vagina. Still, Rachel wasn't sure if she actually wanted to press charges. Marvin had threatened to kill Shannon if charges were filed. More than anything else, Rachel wanted to protect her daughter. Nothing in Rachel's life mattered to her more than Shannon. But there was another reason why Rachel was hesitant to press charges. She'd been raped before and nobody did anything about it the first time. At 5 years old, she'd been molested by a babysitter. Nothing ever came of it, even after her parents filed a police report. Why would things be different now? Rachel Timmerman would end up going to jail before Marvin Gabriel. When it became clear that Rachel would be pressing charges after all, Marvin retaliated by calling the cops and telling them that Rachel had been smoking marijuana while on probation. Rachel was arrested and sentenced to 5 months in jail. Rachel reported to Newaygo County Jail on January 11, 1997. At this point, she was still covered in visible scratches and scars from her fight with Marvin. Rachel's 19th birthday, the last birthday she would ever have, was spent incarcerated. She worried if Shannon would still remember her when she got out. Once a week, Tim would bring in Shannon for visiting time but Rachel would have to look at her through a plastic window. Rachel would anticipate these scant visitations all week, but she always left disappointed. Rachel tried to make the best of her time in jail. Her cellmate was a 27-year-old woman named Charlene Madden who was in jail for prostitution. They got along well and Charlene would later correspond with Rachel's father, Tim Timmerman. Charlene encouraged Rachel to complete her GED while in jail and Rachel did so. Rachel had dropped out of high school after becoming pregnant with Shannon. Part 2, Maximum Heartbreak. 9 days after Rachel was imprisoned, Marvin was arrested and charged with third-degree sexual assault on January 20, 1997. At that time, he was served a warrant which listed people who'd been subpoenaed to testify against him at trial, a list which included Wayne Davis, Rachel Timmerman, and Mikey Gabriel. If convicted, he would face up to 15 years in prison. Marvin was released on bond on February 3. Rachel would not be released until 92 days later. Marvin was also able to get his rape trial delayed considerably because the state's most important witness was now in jail. Less than 2 weeks after Marvin was released on bail, Wayne Davis suddenly vanished. He was last seen alive on February 12, 1997. The next day, his girlfriend visited his house but found it deserted. Wayne was nowhere to be found. The girlfriend, Darlene Lazo, did find a note from Wayne Davis, which said that he decided to move to California. However, Lazo looked around the house and found that all of Wayne's clothes were still there, nothing had been packed up. In particular, his camouflage field jacket was still in the house and Lazo knew that Wayne never left home without it. Lazo also noticed that Wayne's microwave oven was missing, along with some stereo equipment. Those items would later be found at a consignment shop in Mecosta County. The owner of the store, Alice Ray, would identify Marvin Gabriel as the man who'd sold her those objects. Wayne Davis wasn't found until 2002, when he was found in a lake, weighted down with chains and cinder blocks. While in jail, Rachel lived in a gray prison cell packed with 7 other women. Her only comfort was letters she received from family. But she also received strange letters from a person claiming to be Marvin's mother. The writer begged Rachel to drop the charges against Marvin, telling her to admit she'd made up the whole rape story. But the letters also asked questions about Shannon. The writer wanted to know who was taking care of Shannon while Rachel was in jail and where that person was living. Rachel Timmerman was released from jail on May 5, 1997. She decided to move into her dad's house instead of moving back in with her mom, because she knew that Marvin knew where her mother lived. And so Rachel took up residence with her dad, Tim Timmerman, and her stepmother Lynn. Unfortunately, it seems like Marvin was able to figure out where she was living pretty quickly. Rachel consistently expressed to friends, family, and coworkers that she was terrified Marvin would kill her for testifying. At one point, she apparently had some sort of panic attack. Rachel ran to a friend's house where she immediately closed all the windows, lowered the curtains, locked all the doors, and barricaded herself inside a room. During this episode, she kept repeating "he will kill me" over and over again. Rachel was last seen by her family on June 3, 1997. This was 29 days after she was released from jail and 2 days before she was scheduled to testify at Marvin's pretrial hearing. On that night of June 3, she went out on a date with a young man named John Weeks. Rachel didn't really know John, but one day he'd started calling her and asking her to go out on a date with him. Rachel initially refused, because she did not know him. Nevertheless, he persisted and Rachel eventually agreed to go out with him. John told her to bring Shannon along with her on the date, because he thought babies were adorable. By all accounts, Rachel was excited and happy when she left to go on the date with John. After spending 5 months in jail and living in constant fear of Marvin, this was a welcome distraction. It was also a return to normalcy. Her father waved her goodbye on her way out, unaware that he would never see Rachel alive ever again. As she was leaving, Rachel smiled broadly and told her dad that she'd be back in a couple hours. Rachel never returned from her date with John Weeks. A few days later, Tim Timmerman received a letter from Rachel. The letter said that the date had gone so well that they decided to get married. They were eloping to Arkansas. The next day, Tim received another letter from Rachel. This time she said that her new husband had gotten a great job in Arkansas and so she would not be coming home. Crystal Roach, the prosecutor who was handling the rape charges against Marvin, also received a letter from Rachel. In this letter, Rachel admitted that she'd made up the rape accusations for attention. Rachel apologized for making false accusations and begged the prosecutor to drop the charges against Gabriel. Tim and Lynn Timmerman didn't know what to make of the bizarre letters. The letters didn't seem to make any sense, but they were in Rachel's handwriting. Rachel had made questionable decisions before. Was it really impossible that she'd suddenly run off with some guy she just met? Maybe she was happily married in Arkansas and there was nothing to worry about. June 15 was when they finally hit a wall and they couldn't deny reality any longer. June 15 was Shannon's birthday, yet they'd heard nothing about her. No pictures. No letters. No acknowledgement of her daughter's first birthday. It was like Rachel had fallen off the face of the earth. On July 5, 1997, 2 fishermen were fishing at Oxford Lake in Newaygo County, Michigan. To their shock and horror, they found the body of a young woman. Tim Timmerman was at work when he heard the news that a woman had been found in a lake. Tim immediately knew that this would be Rachel. Dental records would eventually confirm what Tim already suspected. Rachel Timmerman's funeral was held on July 17, 1997. Shortly after the ceremony, her parents received letters of condolence from a number of women who Rachel had met while in jail. Most of these women were still incarcerated. They spoke of Rachel's caring nature, how she'd been a source of comfort for other inmates, how they'd bonded over playing chess and praying together, and how much she loved her baby Shannon. Rachel's parents were immensely grateful for these letters and wrote letters of thanks to each of the women, only to find out a few months later that nearly all the thank you letters they'd sent to the incarcerated women had been confiscated and destroyed by prison staff without the women ever seeing them. Only one letter got through to Charlene Madden, who had been Rachel's cellmate while she was in jail. She immediately wrote back in a detailed letter. Part 3, Premeditated Malice. When Rachel first started receiving phone calls from John Weeks, all she really knew about him is that he was an occasional customer at the restaurant she worked at. What exactly he said to her over the phone is unknown, but he was able to overcome her initial hesitation and coax her into bringing Shannon on a date with him. But unbeknownst to Rachel, John was working for Marvin Gabriel all along. It is unclear why John went along with this murderous plan. We'll never know the specifics of how it went down, but this is what probably happened. Rachel and John went out on their date and all was normal until suddenly Marvin joined them. Upon seeing Marvin, Rachel would have tried to run away. A witness later saw Marvin covered in scratches and bruises around this time, so Rachel didn't go without a fight. But she was no match for the two men. Rachel was taken out to a remote campground near Oxford Lake where she was coerced into writing the letters wherein she disavowed the rape accusations against Marvin and said she was moving to Arkansas. For example, a letter received by Tim Timmerman was written as follows. Dad? I'm sorry I left without saying goodbye. That guy who picked me up is like the man of my dreams. Shannon bonded with him so well and so did I. Right now we're on vacation. Maybe we might get eloped. He already asked me to marry him. I'll be gone for a couple of weeks. I would call you on the phone, but I think you'd try to talk me out of the marriage. I'll write more letters and send you my address when I get one. Love, Rachel. Once the letters were written, Rachel was handcuffed and bound with chains connected to cinder blocks. A gag was pushed into her mouth and then her mouth was sealed shut with duct tape. Duct tape was also placed over her eyes, but not her nose was left uncovered. She was then placed in a small boat and paddled out to Oxford Lake, where she was pushed into the water. Rachel would have quickly plunged through the water, into the layer of soft mud below. There she would die alone in total darkness, unaware if anybody would ever know what happened to her. Karma would catch up with John Weeks very quickly, since he was killed by Marvin soon after the murder of Rachel Timmerman. John was last seen on June 22, 1997. On that day, John told his girlfriend that he was going down to Texas with Marvin to purchase marijuana. John never returned from that road trip. It is generally believed that Marvin killed John Weeks in order to tie up loose ends. The body of John Weeks has never been found, but he is probably in a lake somewhere in Michigan. Soon after killing John Weeks, Marvin fled the state of Michigan and went into hiding. He was eventually arrested by an FBI SWAT team in the state of New York. The FBI figured out that Marvin likely killed a man named Robert Allen in 1995 or 1996. Since then, Marvin had been collecting Robert's disability benefits from the government. Marvin also occasionally used Robert Allen's identity as one of his many aliases. Robert Allen hadn't had a lot of friends or family, so his disappearance had largely gone unnoticed. It was only after the FBI started probing into Marvin's finances in connection to the Rachel Timmerman case that they realized Marvin had been collecting another man's benefits. Marvin was having Robert Allen's benefits checks sent to a small post office in Sherman, New York. At the time, Sherman had a large Amish population and so Marvin had grown a large, Amish-style beard in order to blend in. The body of Robert Allen has never been found, but he is presumed deceased. It is all but certain that Marvin killed Robert in order to steal his identity. The arrest occurred on October 14, 1997 in Sherman. A postal clerk named Rita Shaw was included in the plan. All other post office employees were told to stay home that day. When Robert Allen showed up to collect his benefits checks, Rita told him that she had material that would require his signature to collect. But immediately after Robert gave his signature, he suddenly realized that he was being set up. It's not clear what tipped him off, but he bolted out of the office right away. Marvin was extremely fast. Unfortunately for him, it was already too late. A group of plainclothes FBI agents pursued him as he ran toward his vehicle. Someone tackled him as he opened his car door, but he was too strong. He fought like a wild beast. It took the combined force of 6 federal agents to subdue him. You might think that Marvin was being charged for Rachel's murder, but he was actually being charged for Social Security fraud for stealing Robert Allen's identity and benefits. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Marvin's trial for the murder of Rachel Timmerman would not happen until 2002. During his trial, Marvin took the stand to testify in his own defense. He initially claimed to have received a suicide note from Rachel wherein she said that she was going to commit suicide by drowning herself in a lake. Later, he accused Rachel's dad of killing her because she'd brought shame to the family by getting pregnant outside of marriage. He also said that Rachel was a prostitute and suggested that she might have been killed by her pimp. Michigan abolished the death penalty in 1847, so it was unusual that prosecutors were able to ask for the death penalty in this case. But it turns out that Oxford Lake is located inside of a national forest, which meant that prosecutors were able to charge Marvin under the federal death penalty statute. Marvin Gabriel was found guilty of first-degree murder on March 5, 2002. He was sentenced to death. As of July 11, 2021, Marvin is still on federal death row awaiting execution. He's never been convicted for killing any person other than Rachel Timmerman, but he is believed to be responsible for the disappearances of Wayne Davis, John Weeks, Robert Allen, and Shannon Vertage. The body of Wayne Davis was located in 2002, the others remain unaccounted for. 2-month-old baby Dylan was found in a 30-feet well in a crate wrapped in chains and a lock. Dylan was wrapped in plastic bags. His parents were charged and sentenced to life in prison. Children's Services were also investigated for placing Dylan back to his parents' care. Daniel and Jessica Groves are facing life in prison in the death of their 2-month-old son, Dylan. The couple is facing multiple charges, including murder and gross abuse of a corpse. They were arrested in June after Dylan Groves' decomposed body was found at the bottom of a 30-foot well near their home. According to the Montgomery County Coroner's Office, Dylan's body was wrapped in plastic bags and duct tape, then placed in milk crates secured by chains, padlocks and zip ties. Dylan's cause of death was determined as homicidal violence. The child had suffered multiple bone fractures and broken ribs. Methamphetamine and amphetamine were also found in his system. Scioto County authorities believe Dylan, who was born January 10, 2019, died in late March. Scioto County Children's Services opened an investigation into his whereabouts that May after Daniel Groves missed court dates, home visits and doctor's appointments. Dylan was initially placed in foster care after his was born with drugs in his system. His biological father, Daniel Groves, gained custody on a trial basis. On June 11, the couple was reportedly arrested on charges of abduction, kidnapping and interference of custody. That day, Daniel Groves led authorities to Dylan's body after barricading himself inside his home for 6 hours. Days later, the couple was also indicted on charges of aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, gross abuse of a corpse and 4 counts of felonious assault. Dylan's case brought national attention to Ohio's opioid epidemic and the state's family reunification process. Laura Fuller stepped down as director of Scioto County Children's Services after an investigation determined the agency mishandled Dylan's case. On May 2, 2001, John Battaglia shot and killed his 9-year-old daughter Faith and her 6-year-old sister Liberty. He did this while their mother listened on speaker. The last thing she heard before telling her daughters to run was Faith begging, "No, Daddy, please don't do it." Then gunshots. On May 2, 2001, Mary Jane Pearl left her daughters with her estranged husband John Battaglia for a planned dinner at the mall, but he instead took them into his apartment in the Adam Hatz Lofts, Deep Ellum in Dallas. Battaglia called Mary Jane from the apartment. Whilst she listened helplessly, he shot and killed their daughters, ages 6 and 9. During the phone call, he asked Faith to ask her mother, "Why do you want Daddy to go to jail?" Before her death, she cried, "No, Daddy. Please don't do it." Mary Jane then told the girls to run, but it was too late. Battaglia then raised his gun and shot Faith 3 times and shot Liberty 5 times. He then said "Merry fucking Christmas" to their mother, in reference to a Christmas 1999 assault that he blamed her for going the police about. This act was his ultimate revenge. Mary Jane then terminated the call and dialed 911. He then left a message on the girls' answer machine. "Hi, girls. I just want to tell you how very, very brave you were, and I hope you are resting in a better place now. I wish that you had nothing to do with your mother. She's evil and vicious and stupid." After that went to a tattoo parlor and got 2 roses to commemorate his 2 daughters. He was arrested shortly after, but it took 4 officers to subdue him. After deliberating for just 19 minutes, he was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death on April 30, 2002. He was executed by lethal injection on February 1, 2018 at the age of 62. During the execution, he still used his last few moments to taunt his ex-wife. When asked by the warden for any last words, he first said no but then changed his mind. "Well, hi, Mary Jane," he said, looking and smiling at his ex-wife. He continued with "I'll see you all later." He then closed his eyes and laid back. Moments later, opening them and saying, "Am I still alive?" On March 22, 2018, a hysterical and bloodied 20-year-old Ezra McCandless frantically banged on the front door of dairy farmer Don Sipple's home in a remote area of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. What Don and the police didn't know at the time was that Ezra was a cold-blooded killer. On March 22, 2018, A hysterical and bloodied 20-year-old Ezra McCandless frantically banged on the front door of dairy farmer Don Sippel's home in a remote area of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. When Don answered the door, he found a barefooted and muddy Ezra begging for a doctor. The word boy had been cut into her arm, her clothing had been torn, and she couldn't remember her name. Don let Ezra in and consoled her while the two waited for the police. What Don and the police didn't know at the time was that Ezra was a cold-blooded killer. Details of the attack recounted by McCandless were initially hazy, but eventually, she said it was ex-boyfriend Alex Woodworth who attacked her. The police believed they were looking for the perpetrator of a violent attack on McCandless, but that all changed when they found Woodworth's body on a desolate dirt road near the farmhouse. Ezra McCandless, originally Monica Kay, was born on October 6, 1998, to 14-year-old Russell Enagu Nelson, in Stanley, Wisconsin. Her biological father was not a part of her life, but her mother's partner, Josh Carlin, legally adopted Ezra when she was 4 years old. Even though her mom and dad divorced when Ezra was 12 years old, she continued to have a close relationship with her father. Once Ezra hit high school, she struggled with her identity. She experimented with he/him pronouns and legally changed her name from Monica Kay to Ezra McCandless. Ezra's friends described her as a free-spirited amateur artist who had dropped out of college and moved to Eau Claire, Wisconsin, to focus on her love for art. Ezra enjoyed the attention and loved to stand out. She even used her car as a blank canvas to showcase her artwork. In 2017, 19-year-old Ezra met 33-year-old Jason Mengal, a medic in the Army Reserve. Though they had a wide age gap, Jason said it worked well. He said he kept Ezra energized, and she made him more spontaneous. Jason said Ezra was full of surprises, from changing her name to breaking into abandoned buildings to take photos. They were together for just 8 months, but things progressed quickly. They moved in together and talked about marriage. Jason said they used to play around with calling each other husband and wife. Ezra described their relationship as an ancient love so powerful that it scared them both. But all of that changed when they met Alex Woodworth. Ezra and Jason would often hang out at a local coffee shop called Raciglini's. It was there the two made friends with Alex, who worked as a barista. Alex was not your typical 24-year-old. He had a Bachelor of Science from UW-Eau Claire with a major in philosophy and a minor in biology. He'd started applying to graduate schools to fulfill his lifelong dream of obtaining his PhD and becoming a professor of philosophy. Jason, Ezra, and Alex became fast friends. When Ezra met Alex, she was through some complicated things. In October 2017, she found out she was pregnant with Jason's baby. She knew she wasn't ready for a child, so she'd had an abortion. She was experiencing a lot of guilt, trauma, and feeling very isolated. Jason said it took a toll on their relationship, and he knew Alex would be a great support person for Ezra during this time, so he encouraged them to spend more time together. Of their relationship, Jason said, "She was going through emotional things. He was a really good friend. I kind of pushed them together at one time because I knew they both had similar viewpoints. He had some things in his life that I figured she could help him with, and I thought that he could help her with things in her life." Having found a kindred spirit who she could trust and rely on, as well as finding Alex's theories on philosophy fascinating, one thing led to another, and the two began a secret sexual affair behind Jason's back. But that wasn't enough for Ezra. Jason went away for 2 weeks to work with the National Guard. Before he left, Jason asked his friend John Hansen to look after Ezra. While he was gone, Ezra started another sexual relationship, but this time with Jason's friend John. One night once Jason returned, after Ezra had fallen asleep, he began looking through her phone. He found text messages between Ezra and John and her and Alex, which showed evidence of both relationships. Jason decided to confront Ezra and Alex, devastated that his friend would betray him like that. Alex apologetically admitted the truth. Ezra told Jason that her relationship with John was not consensual and that he had sexually assaulted her at a party. According to Ezra, she was drunk and passed out at the time and couldn't remember the details. Jason immediately went to the police to file a police report. When police interviewed Ezra, she told them the same story. During the interview, she has her knees up by her chest and looks frightened and defenseless. Police found her to be very believable as a victim of sexual assault. But when police investigated the accusation, they discovered the text messages Ezra had sent Jason's friend and began to doubt her version of events. Police then interviewed Alex in connection with Ezra. When they spoke with him, he said Ezra had confided in him that the encounter with John had been consensual, but she regretted it after the fact. The case was ultimately dropped. At this point, relationships with both men ended. Some sources say she ended it with both of them, others say Jason ended it, and then she ended it with Alex. But whatever scenario, in a mere matter of months, Ezra had gone from juggling and deceiving 3 men to being completely alone. Ezra moved out of her shared apartment with Jason in Eau Claire and back home to Stanley to live with her family. Ezra felt like her life was crumbling down around her. She blamed Alex for her and Jason's breakup, and she was desperate to regain some control. In February 2018, Ezra texted Alex saying she never wanted to speak to him again, and Alex respected her wishes. He never contacted her again after that. Jason says she spent this time trying desperately to win him back, but he refused and said he didn't want to get back together, which made Ezra furious. Jason claimed Ezra was manipulative and had taken advantage of all 3 men in the situation. But despite this, the two still stayed in touch and kept speaking regularly. Ezra sent Jason journals in which she expressed her upset at having betrayed him. At around 10:30 a.m., on March 22, 2018, hours before Alex Woodworth was killed, Ezra surprised Jason by turning up unexpectedly at Racy's coffee shop to see him. She'd driven to Eau Claire from Stanley even though her dad had told her not to drive and hid her car keys. Ezra is seen on the coffee shop security footage, and Jason said she seemed visibly agitated and acting out of character. The server told police Ezra did not look like her usual self. She looked disheveled and wasn't wearing makeup, which was not normal for her. Ezra and Jason had messaged each other 600 times the night before. She said she was back in town and planned to go back to Alex's house to return some items to him. According to Jason, she said she wanted to share some of her writings with Alex. Her journal entries expressed that she felt like she'd been assaulted, and she just wanted to get her voice back. Jason said she told him she was taking back her life and becoming Ezra again. Once Ezra left Racy's to go to Alex's house, Jason became increasingly concerned. He said Ezra left with rage in her eyes, and he had a gut feeling that something was wrong. He knew Ezra and Alex hadn't spoken for weeks, so he thought it was incredibly off that she would show up unexpectedly to go and visit him. He decided to follow her and bicycle over to Alex's house. When he arrived, Jason spotted her 2003 Chevy Impala outside, the car's engine still running, music still playing, and the driver's side door still open. He paced back and forth outside the house for 45 minutes before finally deciding to go inside without knocking. Once inside, he said he found Alex and Ezra in the middle of a conversation. He said you could taste the tension in the room and both of their faces were like masks. He said he could tell something was going on, but they were both pretending everything was fine. Jason told them that they should talk in a public place, and they agreed. 3 went outside and were met by a police cruiser. A passerby had seen Jason pacing outside the house and called the police. Dashcam footage shows the police talking to Alex. Ezra is in the driver's seat but is not visible on camera. Jason is out of the shot on his bicycle, but he explains to the officer why he's concerned. He said, "She gave me a vibe today, man. I don't know, it doesn't feel right. Something feels wrong." The officer spoke to Ezra and Alex, and they assured him everything's fine. Ezra even apologized to the officer for causing a fuss. Then the officer says, "I'd rather come here and check, and it be nothing than have something bad happen," which is quite eerie given what happened next. Ultimately, the officer sees nothing of concern, gets in his cruiser, and leaves. Jason wheeled his bike over to Ezra's car, where she's sitting in the driver's seat, and Alex climbed into the passenger seat. He had a quick chat with Alex before they drove away. Just over 3 hours later, Ezra showed up at Don Sippel's farm. While being treated in hospital, Ezra said the last thing she remembered was feeling afraid of Alex. Even though she claimed not to remember any details or even her name, when police asked if there was anyone they could call, she immediately started asking for Jason Mangal. When Ezra was examined, along with her torn and cut clothes, she was found to have 3 superficial cuts to her palm, scratches on her forearm where the word boy had been cut, a couple of scratches on her thigh, some scrapes near her underwear, and a few shallow scratches on her jaw that were gone a couple of days later. When hospital staff asked her how she sustained her injuries, particularly carving the word boy, Ezra claimed that Alex did it. But hospital staff were concerned and confused because they found the injuries appeared to be self-inflicted. Police began the hunt for Alex, who was nowhere to be found. After reaching out to Alex's family and friends and finding no one could locate him, they decided to return to Don Sippel's farm to search. While searching the farm, they drove past a muddy road where they could spot footprints from the top of the hill leading to the main road. They made their way to the top of the hill, and using binoculars, they spotted Ezra's car in the distance, stuck in the mud with a human body hanging out of the back seat. When they reached the scene, they confirmed it to be the body of 24-year-old Alex Woodworth. It was a brutal scene and showed signs of a horrific attack. Alex had been stabbed 16 times in the head, neck, and groin. At this point, the police go back to Ezra and confirm that they'd found the crime scene. That's when she claims details started to come back to her. She admitted to stabbing Alex but said it was in self-defense. She said Alex grabbed her arm and started to carve the word boy into it. Ezra said Alex used to like calling her boy to tease her about how she experimented with different pronouns, even though she doesn't identify that way anymore. But this story doesn't check out because Alex would have had to reach across himself and carve it upside down to do it. When questioned by police on this, Ezra admitted that Alex didn't actually inflict the injury, and she had instead done it to herself. When asked why she did it, Ezra had no answer. Ezra continued her story, claiming that the two ended up in the back seat where Alex began attacking her, cutting her clothes open to trying to sexually assault her. She said she was terrified for her life, didn't know what to do, and grabbed the knife by its jagged blade, wrenched it away from Alex, and began stabbing him in self-defense. But Ezra's hands only have superficial cuts and scrapes, which do not match her version of events. If she'd grabbed the knife by the blade, her hand would have been flayed open. As the police began to examine more and more evidence, they became convinced that Ezra was lying. Ezra claims she began stabbing Alex inside the car, but the blood evidence shows that Alex was stabbed mostly outside the vehicle with more blood loss. Also, Alex had virtually no defensive wounds, suggesting that Ezra took him by surprise, stabbing him first in the back of the head. The police believe the attack began outside the car and that by the time Alex got into the car, he was nearly dead. 2 weeks after Alex Woodworth is killed, Ezra is arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. The trial began on October 15, 2019, at the Dunn County Judicial Center. The defense painted a picture of Ezra being the victim of a cold and calculating Alex obsessed with Ezra. They said he would manipulate and pressure her into sexual acts that she didn't feel comfortable doing. When interviewed in the hospital, Ezra had said she grabbed the knife from Alex by the blade, but at trial, her story changes. She said she kneed him in the groin, which caused him to drop the knife. She said she grabbed it and started stabbing him anywhere and everywhere she could. She said she wasn't trying to kill him, she just wanted to get away and get out of the car. The defense claims she went into shock after realizing that she just killed one of her best friends and blacked out the memory, and that's when she cut her arm with the word boy. But Ezra's story was full of holes, and law enforcement did not believe it for a second. When the prosecution put forth their version of events, Jason Mengal took the stand. Ezra had not seen her ex-boyfriend for a year and a half, and her face lit up when she saw him enter the courtroom. Many pointed out Ezra's bizarre demeanor during the trial. She was criticized for being too calm, smiling too much, and making too many jokes. At one point, Jason stated, "When she was on the witness stand, it didn't seem real. She just seemed at times to be enjoying it." In a weird move, the day that Jason Mengal testified for the prosecution, Ezra was wearing a pink blazer which she removed to show a green cardigan that Jason had bought her like she was sending a message. It was evident that she still held a torch for Jason. The prosecution said that Ezra herself had told police who turned up when she was at Alex's house that she did not feel threatened or in danger with either Jason or Alex. The prosecution also said that the crime scene did not show signs of the struggle Ezra claimed happened. They said Ezra had planned the attack because she'd brought a knife that she'd taken from her dad's place a few days before the murder and then went to visit Alex intending to kill him. According to their theory, Ezra's car became stuck in the mud. The two got out of the vehicle to inspect the situation, and while Alex had his back turned, Ezra attacked him from behind with the knife she had stolen from her father's house. The prosecution believes that because Alex was found hanging out of the back seat of the car, that he either tried to climb back in to escape Ezra and died trying, or that she attempted to drag him out herself so she could drive away, but when that didn't work she had to come up with a different plan. Once Alex, who had suffered 16 stab wounds to his head, neck, groin, and torso, was dead, Ezra spent hours rearranging the evidence to make it look like her version of events was accurate. What's possibly most disturbing is that Alex was found with a scarf around his neck which police believe he used to try and stop the bleeding. On top of that, none of Alex's wounds were fatal in and of themselves, meaning that if he had received medical attention in time, he might have survived. Had Alex been able to call for help, he might still be alive, but Ezra took Alex's phone and smashed it, preventing him from being able to contact anyone for help. Ezra claims she took Alex's phone because she didn't have a phone of her own and that she accidentally broke it when she fell. But investigators felt that Ezra's intention and motive were clear. Ezra still harbored deep feelings of love for Jason, and she felt that with Alex entirely out of the picture, she would have another chance with him. Prosecutors believed Ezra had deliberately driven Alex to a remote area with the intention to brutally murder him. Ezra showed no remorse during the trial. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying herself much of the time. And after deliberating for just 3 hours, the jury returned a guilty verdict of first-degree intentional homicide. When asked why they reached the verdict they did, one juror said the clincher was that Ezra had stabbed Alex in the back of the head first, which is a very intentional act. During sentencing, Ezra delivered a tearful apology to the family of Alex Woodworth, but many found it insincere, and the judge made a point of saying so. Ezra was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum non-parole period of 50 years. Today, she's selling artwork on Instagram to fund her appeal. Her mother runs the account. On August 25, 2016, crossbow killer Brett Ryan murdered his mother and 2 brothers to prevent his mom from revealing his web of lies to his fiancée a month before their wedding. In 2007, Brett Ryan was 26 years old and $60,000 in debt. Brett was the third of 4 brothers. The eldest, Chris, followed by Leland, and then the youngest, A.J. On October 20, 2007, Brett robbed his first bank in Toronto, Ontario. He wrapped his face in hospital bandages, hung his left arm in a sling and shuffled into the branch holding a sheaf of papers. At the counter, he handed the teller a note indicating that he was carrying a gun under the sling and demanding $2,000 or more. The teller quickly complied. Brett received only $1,115, but he made off without getting caught. Over the next 8 months, he robbed another 12 banks along the 401 and around his neighborhood, including his home branch. He stole a total of $28,000. After hitting a second bank with the bandage disguise, he bought a high-quality glue-on beard at a costume supplier. The disguise earned him the nickname the Bearded Bandit in the media. After one of Brett's heists, police spotted his truck on an external camera and tracked him to his home. By the time he entered his last bank, the TD Canada Trust at 3115 Kingston Road, the police had been surveilling him for 2 weeks. He must have suspected something was up. He strode into the bank, then quickly turned around and walked out, where the police were waiting. He pleaded guilty, and spent the next 7 months in custody, awaiting trial. Brett was sentenced to 5 years, but with time served and early parole, he was back home with his family in late 2010, ready to start fresh. In 2011, Brett began dating Kristen Baxter and later they became engaged. In 2015, he dropped out of school again. But he didn't tell his fiancée. Kristen and his family believed that he was still pursuing his studies. In the spring of 2016, Brett caught a lucky break and got a job with a Toronto tech firm. He celebrated his victory with Kristen and his family. But within days of hiring him, his new employer discovered his previous life as the Bearded Bandit. The company promptly rescinded the offer. Rather than admit defeat, he let his family go on believing that he still had a job. He needed to perform the lie every day. Less than a month before the wedding, after a year of piling lie upon lie, Brett finally followed his psychologist's advice. He told his mother, Sue, the truth about what was really going on. Brett received an ultimatum from his mother: tell Kristen everything or Sue would do it herself. She'd give him no more money until he came clean. Brett hoped Sue might be able to see his perspective. But she held her ground, promising to tell Kristen everything if Brett didn't. The argument got heated, and Sue called her eldest son, Chris, on her cell phone, asking him to come over to help her handle his brother. Brett quickly realized the situation was getting away from him. He marched out the back door and headed straight for the garage. Sue followed him. Once in the garage, Brett grabbed a broadhead bolt, with 3 sharp serrated blades that form a point, and stabbed Sue in the cheek and the ear. Then he wrestled her to the ground, behind the pile of hardwood flooring left over from the kitchen renovations. As she struggled, some of the flooring fell on top of her. He took a piece of yellow nylon rope and strangled her with it until she died. After Brett stabbed and strangled his mother to death, he set about cocking a crossbow that was kept in the garage. He knew his brother Chris was on his way, and he needed to be prepared. When Chris came into the garage, Brett stepped up quietly behind him and fired at very close range, so that the 3 blades went through Chris's neck and lodged in his mouth. His brother died immediately. Shortly following Chris's murder, Brett's younger brother, A.J., came home. Brett exited the garage and met A. J. On the walkway to the back door. He was carrying another crossbow bolt in his fist. By this point, he realized he'd gone too far down this nightmarish path not to see it through. They grappled, and Brett stabbed A. J. in the neck. He collapsed onto the driveway. Brett's third brother, Leland, had been napping in his bedroom. He heard the altercation and went outside to see what was going on. When he saw his youngest brother bleeding on the ground, he ran to the phone to call 911. Brett followed him into the house and attacked him. The two brothers stumbled chaotically through the house, down the hallways, into two different bedrooms, fighting and kicking over furniture as they went. Brett was soaked with the blood of his family members. Leland sustained a head wound and bled profusely. As they fought, they left a trail of blood on the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Meanwhile, A. J crawled down the driveway toward the street. He'd made it as far as the front of the house when Leland escaped from his brother and ran outside, where he found A. J still alive, bleeding in the driveway. With Brett in pursuit, Leland ran across the street to get help from his mother's friends Warren and Marie. He hammered on the door. When Warren answered, Leland tumbled into his arms. "Call 911, he told them. "My brother's bleeding in the driveway. Make sure the police come. Make sure the police come." After relaying his message, Leland promptly passed out. Defeated, Brett got a bottle of water from the fridge. He didn't bother shutting the fridge door as he returned to the front stoop. He was waiting there calmly when the police arrived. A. J was still alive when the first responding officer came to the scene, but he died before the paramedics arrived. "I should have driven him to the hospital," Brett told the police. "The guys in the garage are dead. Crossbow to the head. It was me." Brett received concurrent life sentences for each of the murders, plus 10 years for the attempted murder of Leland. He will be eligible for parole in 2041, by which point he'll be 60 years old. Samantha Payne, 29 years old, goes missing after Halloween party. She's later found tied to a tree in Talladega National Forest, with her head detached from her body. 5 people are arrested and charged with kidnapping and torturing her to death. Samantha Payne, a 29-year-old woman from Alabama, was reported missing on November 9, 2015. That same morning, around 9 a.m., a man found Samantha in the Talladega National Forest. He soon contacted law enforcement to report what he'd found. He'd discovered a woman tied to a tree with barbed wire, completely naked. Her throat was slashed open and her skull was detached from her body. On October 30, 2015, Payne left her parents' house. She told her mother that she was going to a Halloween party. It also happened to be her 29th birthday. That was the last time her mother saw Samantha alive. Samantha never returned from the Halloween party. For reasons unclear, the mother Susie Payne did not actually report her daughter missing until November 9, the same day Samantha's tortured remains were discovered in Tuscaloosa County. Dr. Stephen Dunton performed an autopsy on Samantha Payne soon after she was recovered. The autopsy was difficult because the majority of her internal organs were missing. Dunton could not determine the cause or manner of Payne's death. "We just didn't have enough of her remains to identify why she died," he later testified. However, he wrote in his report that the circumstances of her discovery seemed to suggest that Samantha had been murdered. After it was reported that a body had been found in Talladega National Forest, a police officer contacted investigators and told them something strange. He said that he'd recently arrested a suspicious couple near that area. He noticed them because they were completely covered in blood. He found that suspicious. The two were searched, and he found meth on them, so they were arrested. The two were Stephen George and Chili Bruce. It should be noted that Chili was only 18 years old at this time. Investigators met up with Stephen and Chili, and asked them about Samantha Payne. They both said that a man named Belcher was responsible for the murder. Chili and Stephen admitted that they were involved in Payne's death, but they insisted that Belcher was the person who'd actually killed her. Chili, Stephen, and Belcher were all charged with capital murder soon afterward. According to Chili and Stephen, the murder occurred on November 1, and the whole thing began while they were all sitting around doing meth. They were hanging out and getting high at a repair shop owned by Belcher's dad. Stephen decided that they should steal the catalytic converter and battery from Samantha's vehicle. He grabbed her car keys out of her purse while she was using the bathroom, and then he drove her car out to a bridge where he removed the converter and battery from the car. He then punctured the car's fuel tank and set it on fire. It took Samantha a long time to realize that her car was missing, but when she finally noticed, she was angry. She accused the others of stealing her car, and threatened to call the police if they didn't return it. And that, apparently, is when they decided to kill her, because Michael feared that if she called the police, they'd find all the meth. She was taken to Belcher's house, and that is where the torture began. She was forcibly stripped, hogtied, and mercilessly beaten for hours. Her fingernails, toenails, and several teeth were ripped out with pliers. Belcher said they had to kill her, because she'd threatened to call the police about her car being stolen. At the same time, Samantha said she loved and forgave the people that were hurting her, promising to tell nobody if she was let go. This fell on deaf ears. The torture only escalated. Eventually, she was put in the trunk of Belcher's car, and he drove her out to Talladega National Forest. At some point, she actually managed to escape from the trunk, so they had to stop and stuff her back in. Later, they arrived at the forest. That is where she was tied to a tree. Belcher slashed her throat open as she begged for her life. Police executed search warrants on Belcher's home and car, and they found a lot of evidence that seemed to corroborate much of what Chili had told him. Specifically, they found clothes belonging to Payne inside Belcher's car. They also found Payne's car battery inside Belcher's house. Chili Bruce and Stephen George were both eventually allowed to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testifying against Michael Belcher. Chili received a sentence of 20 years, with eligibility for parole after 5 years. Stephen's plea deal was far more severe. He got life in prison with eligibility for parole only after 15 years. Belcher said he was willing to plead guilty if he got the same deal as Stephen, but that was refused. Prosecutors wanted to pursue the death penalty against Belcher and would not offer or accept any plea bargains with him. 2 other people, Alyssa Watson and Marcus George, were later charged as well. However, they were charged with first-degree kidnapping instead of capital murder. The trials of Alyssa and Marcus were combined into a single trial. The most important pieces of evidence were cell phone records and the testimony of Chili and Stephen. The prosecution argued that cell phone pings proved that the 2 defendants were at the scene of the crime while Samantha was being tortured, and they made no attempt to help her. Marcus and Alyssa were both found guilty of first-degree kidnapping, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Michael Belcher's trial began on March 11, 2019. His attorney did not argue that he was innocent. Instead, he argued that Belcher should be found guilty of felony murder instead of capital murder. His attorney said, "Michael Belcher didn't start this, he didn't stop it, but he didn't start it." However, Belcher was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. Chelsea Bruck, 22 years old. Michigan woman dressed as Batman villain goes missing after Halloween party, triggering a statewide search and media frenzy. Police chase multiple false leads before arriving at a dead end. She is eventually found buried on a farmer's property. Chelsea Bruck, a 22-year-old woman, was reported missing on October 28, 2014. At the time, she was living in Monroe County, Michigan. Chelsea was last seen on October 26, at a Halloween party. She'd gone dressed as the Batman character Poison Ivy. She'd put a lot of work into her costume. The party was held in a cornfield, near Big Mike's farmhouse. The party was hosted in Frenchtown Township, and it was organized by a man known as Big Mike. The Halloween party was an annual event, but this year would be bigger and better than ever. 8 heavy metal bands were scheduled to play, including Big Mike's own band Pickaxe Preacher. It was expected that around 350 people would show up, but well over double that number ended up attending that year. The party was known as Big Mike's Halloween Bash. Chelsea had spent a lot of time building her Poison Ivy costume, which she'd made herself. The costume consisted of a green suit and black leggings, covered with plastic leaves which Bruck had sewn onto the fabric. She'd started making this costume during the summer. Now it was finally time for her to wear it. She hoped to win a prize for best costume at the party. Chelsea did not have her own car, and in fact she could not drive at all. She did not even have a driver's license. She was driven to the party by a friend, Becky. She left her cell phone and purse in Becky's car because her costume did not have any pockets. However, this meant that when Becky left the party, Chelsea was left without her cell phone. Chelsea had a great time at the party, until she injured her head. She was intoxicated and she ran into a post, smashing her nose. After that, she then told her friends that she wanted to leave. She felt confused and disoriented from the head injury, and her nose was bleeding profusely. But her friends weren't ready to leave yet. They wanted to keep partying. Chelsea would have to wait for her friends to be done at the party before she could get a ride home. However, Chelsea became separated from her friends and they ended up leaving without her around 1 a.m. She was seen in the parking lot around 3 a.m., crying. She said that she'd been abandoned and she needed a ride home. Bruck's friends have both said that leaving Chelsea at that party is and always will be the greatest regret of their lives. Both of the friends were very active in the search for Chelsea. They cared a lot about Chelsea and they understood that they'd made a huge mistake. When Big Mike awoke the day after the party, he found that he'd already received dozens of text messages asking if he knew what happened to Chelsea. He didn't know who Chelsea was, but he agreed to look around the farm field to see if maybe she'd passed out or something. But while he was searching through the cornfield with his dog, the dog got stuck in a trap and was injured. Brooke was reported missing by her family on October 28, after she failed to return home. That same day, Chelsea's mother Leanda personally drove out to Big Mike's farmhouse and demanded the right to search his property. Big Mike told her that he needed to take his dog to the vet, but also told her that she was free to search while he was gone. When he returned from the vet, he found the Brooke family was already searching his property along with 15 other people. They were planning to stay until Chelsea was found no matter what. Big Mike quickly became the focus of much suspicion. Brooke's family told news outlets that they believed he was responsible for Chelsea's disappearance. They said she was probably tied up in his basement. Their suspicions were confirmed when Big Mike refused to allow police to search his home. He also refused to take a polygraph or provide a DNA sample. However, when the police got a warrant and forced their way in, they found nothing of interest. Families of missing persons have an alarming tendency to get fixated on one person who they know is responsible. Sometimes they're right, but more often they're wrong. Big Mike was not responsible for Brooke's disappearance. Big Mike has said that in the weeks after Chelsea's initial disappearance, random people were constantly coming onto his property to look for Chelsea. Some even tried to break into his house. Perhaps most disturbingly, he'd often wake up in the middle of the night to find drones hovering outside his windows, peeking inside. Eventually, witness came forward and told police that he saw Chelsea leave the party with a man. The witness reported that Chelsea seemed quite comfortable around this man. It seemed like she knew him and vice versa. The man apparently made some joke about being allergic to poison ivy, in reference to Chelsea's costume. Chelsea and the man hung out together at the party for a bit, then left together in the man's car. The witness was able to help police produce a sketch of the man who'd left with Chelsea. The sketch was then displayed on news channels throughout Michigan as the police solicited the public for help in finding the mystery man. The sketch generated hundreds of tips but none of them amounted to anything. It seems like this tip must have been inaccurate because the actual killer ended up looking nothing like the sketch. Suddenly, there was a break in the case. A man named Harlan Bird came forward and told police that he'd seen a group of men harassing Chelsea at the party. Harlan said he'd chased them off, then he'd left Chelsea in a truck while he left to go get help. But when he came back, both Chelsea and the truck were gone. Harlan also said that Chelsea's bloody nose had dripped blood all over his shirt, but when police asked him to give them the shirt for testing, he said he'd already washed it. Something bothered detectives about Harlan's story. He described Chelsea as having blonde hair. And Chelsea did have blonde hair, but she dyed her hair purple red to better match with her costume. So why was Chelsea's hair blonde in Harlan's story? Eventually, they were able to get Harlan to admit that he'd made up the whole story. He wanted to look like a hero for helping the police solve a missing person case even though he had no actual relevant information. At this point, the detectives were quite sure they'd found their killer. To them, it seemed like Harlan had tried to insert himself into the investigation, which is a huge red flag. And while his story had inconsistencies, Harlan had admitted to seeing Chelsea and putting her in a car. They knew they couldn't charge him with murder yet until they had more evidence on him, but their working theory at this point was that he'd killed Chelsea. Then, the police got another seemingly valuable tip from a woman named Carrie Carr. Carrie lived in Ohio, but she'd seen information about the Brooke disappearance online and she was certain that her boyfriend was responsible. He'd told Carrie that he'd kidnapped Chelsea and killed her. Carrie emphasized that she was sure her boyfriend would try to kill her if he found out she'd told. She implored the police that if they brought him in for questioning, they had to arrest him right then and there. She was emphatic that if they talked to this guy, then they absolutely had to detain him. So they brought the boyfriend in for questioning, and he immediately said that Carrie was trying to frame him. The police never mentioned Carrie to him, he just knew she was responsible. The boyfriend told police that Carrie was lying and she was just trying to get him in trouble. The boyfriend's alibi was corroborated and then Carrie was arrested for lying to police. She admitted that she'd made it all up. No significant progress was made until April 5, 2015. The poison ivy costume which Brooke had worked so hard to create was found in an abandoned building by a pair of men who were doing something illegal there. The man who found the costume was apparently terrified to call the police about it because he'd picked up the costume with his hands when he first found it, before he'd realized its significance. He knew his DNA would be on the costume, and so he was afraid they'd think he killed Chelsea. However, he eventually did the right thing and reported it. Ominously, when police received the costume they discovered it was ripped around the crotch area. However, the detectives working the case also discovered an interesting coincidence. It turned out that Harlan Bird, remember, the guy who wanted to be a hero, lived extremely close to where the costume was found. Basically right across the street. So they pulled in Harlan again, and this time they were sure he was the guy. Because you have to admit, he was starting to look like a pretty viable suspect at this point. He'd tried to insert himself into the investigation, he lied to police, he admitted to putting Chelsea in a car, and now her costume was found right across from where he lived. Sure, they still weren't gonna charge him with murder just yet, but they were definitely heading in that direction. But this time, Harlan was smart and brought a lawyer with him. Harlan admitted he'd lied before but said he hadn't killed Chelsea. He agreed to take a polygraph and he passed, eliminating him as a suspect. Chelsea Bruck was found deceased on April 25, 2015. It should go without saying that her family was devastated. She was found buried on the property of a farmer who lived near Big Mike's farmhouse. The farmer was having a new building constructed and one of the workers ended up finding the body during excavations. Chelsea Bruck's leggings were found on September 2, 2015. This was a huge break for the case, because the leggings were the first item from which the police were able to get a viable DNA sample. They were able to find DNA from an unknown male. The significance of this can't be overstated, since it finally gave detectives a way to start eliminating suspects. Harlan Bird and Carrie Carr's boyfriend both submitted DNA samples and were cleared, finally eliminating them as suspects once and for all. Big Mike still was reluctant, but eventually he did agree to provide a sample. Big Mike was also cleared. The man who'd found the costume was also tested and cleared. Every other person who'd been considered by police were also cleared, leaving the police with no suspects. Everybody was cleared, they'd reached another dead end. The big break finally came when the detectives were contacted by the Michigan Forensics Laboratory, which informed them they'd found a match for the unknown male DNA found on Bruck's leggings. The DNA was found to be a match for Daniel Clay. Daniel had recently been arrested for stealing a backpack, and so his DNA had been collected and added to the Michigan DNA database. It must be noted that this case truly would have been 100% unsolvable if not for DNA testing, because Daniel had never even remotely been considered as a suspect up to this point. When the detective spoke with Daniel Clay, he initially denied that he'd ever seen Bruck or spoken to her. However, one of the detectives came up with a sneaky ploy to get him talking. He told Clay that Chelsea Bruck suffered from brittle bone disease, and so if something happened it was probably an accident. Daniel fell hard for that obvious bait, and immediately changed his story to say that he accidentally killed Chelsea while having totally consensual sex with her. He told police that Chelsea liked it rough and that she'd begged him to choke her during sex, but he'd accidentally squeezed a bit too hard. Whoopsie. Must have been the brittle bone disease. Clay was charged with second-degree murder on July 25, 2016. However, that was soon increased to first-degree murder. In Michigan, a conviction for first-degree results in an automatic life sentence without parole. Second-degree murder is also punishable by life imprisonment, but it isn't automatic. During Clay's trial, the defense had to try and argue that Clay really had unintentionally killed during rough sex. But thankfully, a judge ruled that the defense couldn't probe into Chelsea's sexual history during the trial. I'm normally on the side of the defense should be allowed to do whatever they want, but I'm glad that Chelsea's family was spared that. Clay was found guilty of first-degree murder on May 16, 2017. Chelsea Bruck was buried in the town of Maybe, where she was born. According to Find a Grave, her obituary reads as follows. As a hostess, she was employed by Olga's Kitchen at the Mall of Monroe for 4 years. Her favorite pastimes included watching movies, especially musicals, listening to music, of which Queen was her favorite band, enjoyed playing video games, including Final Fantasy VIII, and her favorite television show, Doctor Who. She also enjoyed reading and baking, and had a special love for her dog and cats. She was raised very close to her siblings and loved being a part of the Bruck girls.